Aster is the slum-born troublemaker who dies fighting House Declan, then wakes up in his old life with one goal left: survive long enough to build the tower his dead comrades dreamed about, and pay Declan back for the murder. The problem is, his second chance starts under a sky full of enemies, and the first thing that drops out of it is something strong enough to make ordinary mages look like insects. The attack lands with brutal force, and whoever is on the ground is already paying for the gap in strength. Aster is not dealing with a duel here, he is facing a killing formation, which means this is less about skill and more about whether he can stay conscious long enough to stop getting erased. Then the enemy's confidence cracks into something worse, because this was never a lone raid. The sky fills with more dark shapes, and the taunt makes the situation plain. Aster's hunters brought backup, which is exactly the kind of generosity that gets people buried. Back in the middle of that chaos, Aster is still not fully in control of the power inside him, and everyone around him can see it. That is the real danger. House Declan is chasing a half-awakened monster, and the people on the field are starting to realize they may have mistimed the hunt. The enemy moves to finish him, but Aster answers with the one thing he does have: raw survival instinct and enough rage to spit in their face. He hits back hard enough to turn the exchange, and for a second the hunted boy stops looking like prey and starts looking like a problem. That turn forces a much bigger truth into the open. The battlefield is not just hosting Declan forces, it is waking something stranger. A single word, continent, comes with a surge of power and a transformed presence that swallows 3 figures whole, proving this fight has already outgrown the original plan. Now the scene widens to show the aftermath, and the scale gets uglier. Under the storm-dark sky, the survivors are left staring at a force so overwhelming that one of them can only mutter that this is becoming a pain in the ass, which is a polite way of saying the day is going badly. In the ruins of that clash, Aster stands with the blue tome in hand on barren mountain ground, and the fight starts looking like a test of whether he can turn power into direction. The enemy still tries to drag him back under Declan's wing, but Aster is no longer a stray they can simply collect and leash. Even after all that, the pressure does not let up, because the last exchange leaves Aster cornered and expected to answer for himself. He is reduced to a tense, exhausted stare-down, and the question hanging over him is simple. Does he fold back into Declan's control, or does he keep pushing toward his own tower and his revenge? Aster finally stops looking like prey and starts acting like the problem. He rises into the sky with the blue tome in hand, while the opponent comes down hard to keep him trapped in House Declan's grip. But Aster answers with a grin that says he is done asking permission. The poor guy on the other side is already feeling it, because this fight is no longer about survival alone. It is about whether Aster keeps his own will or gets dragged back into Declan's kennel. Now the clash turns into a contest of raw magical pressure, and Aster commits to the kind of power that only works if he refuses to hesitate. He pulls the spell from the tome and forces the enemy to brace for a hit big enough to decide the whole exchange, which is the first real sign that Aster is not just enduring this life, he is starting to command it. The other mage answers in kind, because backing off here means admitting Aster has outgrown the leash. The opponent gets driven back by the pressure, and that cost matters more than the impact itself. Aster's recovery has turned into offense, which means every second he stays on his feet makes Declan's control look weaker and weaker. Even the taunts in the middle of it only sharpen the point. This is no clean obedience test anymore. It is a fight over who gets to decide Aster's future. Then the spellwork stops being a duel and becomes a full-blown disaster in the sky. Red Force crashes down, the blast swells out of control, and the whole exchange turns into a brutal proof that both sides are willing to burn through everything to win. Aster is not just dodging a hit now, he is surviving the kind of magic that can end a second life before it ever gets moving. The fight widens into a final escalation, and the other mage keeps climbing the spell ladder, because stopping now would mean losing face and ground at once. Massive circles, maintained spells, and a growing storm of power all stack into the same ugly truth. Neither side is folding, so the sky becomes the battlefield. That is the moment the scene stops being a skirmish and starts looking like a statement. Aster drops out of the storm, beaten but not broken, and the whole point of the scene lands right away. House Declan wants him down, while he is still refusing to stay there. Even with blood on his face and pain in his eyes, he keeps staring forward instead of kneeling, which is his way of saying the fight is over but the submission is not. The pressure keeps building because the enemy still has the upper hand in raw force, and Aster answers by pushing back with the tome in his hands instead of giving in. That turns the clash into a test of will, not just magic, and the other side makes the demand plain. They want Aster, and they want the book too. Aster does not bargain. He explodes with the only answer that matters here, which is refusal. The other mage laughs like this is still under control, but the moment Aster starts fighting back, the confrontation stops being about capture and becomes about who gets to define his future. Back in the present of the argument, Aster states the real reason he will never crawl back. Revenge is not a side goal, it is the engine. He rejects House Declan's kennel outright, because going back would mean surrendering the second life he fought to keep. That refusal pulls the story into something older and quieter, because once Aster refuses to be owned, he starts remembering what he is actually fighting for. He says this is definitely him, but the memory drifts back to when he was younger, and the tone shifts from combat to the dream that kept him alive in the first place. Years earlier, in the Black-White Zone, Aster and his comrades are just vagrants with nothing to their names, so survival itself becomes their daily plan. They do not just lack food and clothes, they lack education too, and that matters because the scene makes it clear they were trapped by ignorance as much as by poverty. Aster takes that memory and turns it into a promise. If he is ever going to rise above the slums, he needs knowledge, not just strength. His expression hardens here because the tower stops being a childish dream and becomes a weapon, a refuge, and a way to stalk every book he can find. Aster is still stuck in that miserable memory, where the only thing the slums ever teach is how to survive without food, clothes, or schooling. So when his mind snaps back to the idea of the tower, it is no longer a dream for later, it is the only way he sees to escape ignorance and build something House Declan can never kennel again. Then the scene turns vicious, because the moment someone starts talking about exposing House Declan's secret manual, the whole conversation becomes a fight over power, not books. Aster lunges in hard, and the clash immediately tells you what he loses if he hesitates here. The chance to push back before Declan's people close the net again. Years later, in the Black-White Zone, Aster sees that the same oppression has bred different survivors, including Blando, a fallen noble house ruined by Declan. When someone points out that Blando should still be doing well, the answer is less a mystery than a warning. Nobility does not protect you once the powerful decide to burn you down. Back in the present battle, Aster's frustration boils over, and his power starts answering before his pride does. That is the dangerous part of his second life. When the pressure rises, he stops being a boy from the slums and starts becoming the thing his enemies can barely survive. Now the wider conflict starts bleeding into the scene, because Aster is no longer just reacting to one enemy. A healing hand, a monster report from the soft estate, and the mention of dozens already dead all point to a larger mess where noble houses, forbidden techniques, and desperate calls for help are colliding at once. After that, the pace jumps into another burst of violence, and Aster answers the chaos with the kind of power that scares people into calling him a problem instead of a person. He drives the fight toward raw destruction, because at this point survival means proving he can still win when everything is being thrown at him. Aster keeps the odd golden orbs in front of him, and Damien immediately wants to know what they are, because in this world anything bright enough to be worth asking about is usually worth stealing, eating, or both. Aster answers like a guy who has decided friendship is a binding contract now, not a feeling, and he pushes for sharing with the same confidence he'd use to kick down a door. Then Aster does something even stranger than the golden orbs. He treats the whole exchange like it is perfectly normal, which tells Damien he is dealing with a man whose idea of manners is mostly just possession with better posture. The joke lands hard because Aster's version of friendship somehow includes taking what the other person has and calling it mutual. Back in the cells, Aster runs into the same kind of personal nonsense that keeps derailing him from simple answers. He hears someone talk about fathers, denies it, and then immediately starts looking for a missing woman, which means this conversation is less about family and more about people realizing they are all carrying damaged histories they never properly sorted out. Aster starts counting days and falls into the ugly realization that time has moved while he was out of sorts. That matters because his second life is not a clean reset. It is a race against the clock, and even a few lost days can decide who gets stronger first. From there, the scene finally shifts into the real point of all this loose talk. Aster has been practicing breathing, the most basic looking thing in the world, and still the difference between surviving and getting folded in half. He is not learning one skill, he is rebuilding himself from a pile of hard lessons, because he already knows brute force alone is not enough to beat the people who killed him. That training has a brutal origin. Right before he died, Aster encountered a bundle of different arts, and instead of treating them like separate tricks, he memorized them as one working system, which is how he keeps living when he should not. Now the payoff hits. The breathing method he locked into his body finally wakes his power back up. Aster's red force erupts through him, and he comes out of it fully armed, which turns a memory into a weapon and proves his second life is already moving beyond mere recovery. Aster's shock breaks first, because the breathing method he buried in his body finally starts paying rent. The hidden system around his power wakes up in layers, and he realizes this is not random talent anymore, but a framework he can actually build on. Back in the present, Aster takes that surge and turns it into confidence instead of panic. He stands his ground, reads the opening, and understands his chances just got better, which is exactly the kind of math a man needs when House Declan is still out there hunting him. Then Aster stops thinking like a survivor and starts acting like someone building toward revenge. He reaches for a larger spell, not to show off, but because his second life only works if his power keeps growing faster than the people trying to bury him. That pressure snaps the scene into open violence, and Aster does not come in soft. The hit lands, the target drops, and the point is clear. He is no longer the boy who gets dragged around by stronger houses. The fight escalates into something uglier, because raw force alone is not the end of it. Aster pushes the magic further, the opposing side gets overwhelmed, and the blast sends them reeling, proving that his second life now has teeth. Aster stands in the wreckage he just made, and the silence after the hit tells the real story. He is no longer improvising. He is learning how to finish fights with mana itself. A nearby voice gives him the rule in plain terms: clench the fist and strike fast, because in this world, power only matters if it lands before the other side recovers. Damien, the young master caught in the exchange, finally registers that Aster is not some stray slumpunk throwing luck around. The shock on his face, with those strange mismatched eyes, says the duel has turned personal and ugly fast, because Aster is hitting like someone who already died once, and is not eager to repeat the experience. A mage rushes in to heal the fallen, which means this fight is no longer just about who hits harder, but about who can keep a side standing long enough to matter. The little burst of relief between two figures is the calm before the next blast, and it only lasts because somebody remembers to patch the body before the pride. Then the whole thing blows open again over the city rooftops, because the duel has become a public test of force instead of a private scrap. Bodies hit the brick, one fighter draws on a fresh surge, and the other side answers by taking the attack head-on, which proves nobody here can afford to blink. Nice work if you enjoy people treating a plaza like a training floor. One of them tries to stand back up and act fearless. But the effort is the point. This battle is chewing through stamina, not just ego. When he laughs off the pain and asks if it is his turn, the mood flips from panic to stubborn confidence. And that tells us the team has finally settled into the kind of fight where coordination starts to matter. The scene then pulls back into the wider night, where two figures on a rooftop are trying to make sense of the chase closing in on them. A worried voice admits the situation is getting difficult. And that matters because Aster is not just fighting whoever is in front of him anymore, he is being hunted through a bigger web than he can brute force forever. Back with Aster, he feels the pressure of that pursuit and answers the only way he knows how, by compressing his magic until it becomes a weapon that can end the moment before the hunter closes the gap. He gets knocked around anyway, which proves the cost of his growth is still real, but he keeps one chance in hand and spends it on a final strike instead of retreating. Back in the present night, the fight gives way to a more grounded conversation near a grand gothic building, and Damien steps into the role of the curious young master, asking whether this is Aster's first official visit. That shift matters because it drags Aster out of pure survival mode and into the world of houses, status, and whatever game he is being pulled into next. Years before the present, the conversation shifts into one of those quiet noble house moments where everybody sounds polite and nobody is actually relaxed. Damien, the young master, is ushered farther inside, which matters because this is no longer a street-level brawl story. It is a story about status, access, and who gets to walk through which door. Inside the warm hall, Damien is remembered as someone who used to live in the black and white zone, the slum district where people scrape by with nothing and still get looked down on for it. That old background makes his presence here a small miracle and a big target, so the staff treat his safety like a serious matter instead of a formality. Callahan, Declan's red-haired Mage Corps vice leader, steps in with the kind of calm that only comes from being powerful enough to stop worrying about manners. He checks whether Damien is unharmed, then lets the tension drop just enough to show this was an inspection, not a welcome party, which is a very noble house way to be friendly. The talk turns to what Damien has actually done, and the answer is that he doesn't just stumble into danger anymore, he comes prepared for it. The real surprise is the friend he brings with him, because before Aster even reveals himself, he is already thinking about a counterattack, and the thing in the boy's hand is a mana bullet, not a bluff. Back in the canyon, the memory sharpens into something uglier. A child stands in a doorway while danger looms over him, and the adults around him clearly do not agree on what should happen next. The argument gets messy fast, because the older man hears something he thinks is a curse, while the younger one pushes back hard enough to prove he is not some helpless spare body. Still in the canyon, the warning lands. Someone tells him to endure, and the line about a goblin in the canyon stops being a saying and turns into a literal threat. Then the truth gets even worse, because the canyon is exactly where he stands. A goblin is right there, and Aster is forced to face the fact that the world around him is already bigger and nastier than he can measure. The story pivots here. Aster leaves the raw survival phase behind and gets pulled into the messier world of guild politics, where every smile hides a rule and every rule hides a knife. If he wants power, allies, and a real shot at House Declan, he has to read people as carefully as he reads spells. The butler master, a polished power broker who clearly likes testing people before he trusts them, sizes Aster up and puts him on the spot. Aster answers with enough backbone to earn a reaction instead of a dismissal, which matters because this kind of room only respects people who can hold their ground. From there, the recap cuts to a stranger problem. Not combat first, but identity and pressure, with intense faces, ominous figures, and officials picking sides. The point is simple enough for even the fussiest noble hall to understand. Somebody is being evaluated, and the wrong answer can decide who gets pulled forward and who gets crushed. Then the magic finally stops pretending to be polite. One figure shows real power, another steps in to steady a younger man, and that younger man accepts responsibility instead of flinching, which turns the whole exchange into a commitment rather than a ceremony. Aster is not just being watched now, he is being handed a role, and that role comes with a cost. Back in the grand interior, the adults keep trying to shape the next generation into useful pieces, and a younger woman gets visibly shaken because she can already tell this is not a normal conversation. The tension spikes when she grabs at the strange-eyed figure and calls out to the white-haired youth, and the room's reaction makes it clear that whatever bond or recognition is happening here, it is not something the others are prepared to handle neatly. Now the scene turns into a formal duel setup, which means the nice talk is over and the rules are about to decide who gets control of the room. One man lays out the structure, the other resists the terms, and the key warning lands plainly. The instructor can stop the duel whenever he wants, so this is a test of discipline as much as strength. The duel stops being a polite demonstration and turns into a raw contest of force, with one side trying to overwhelm the room and the other refusing to give ground. That matters because this is the first real proof that Aster can survive the kind of magical pressure House Declan uses to sort winners from corpses. When the exchange keeps escalating instead of ending, everybody gets dragged into the blast radius, and the lesson becomes obvious. This fight is not about style, it is about who breaks first. Aster is right in the middle of that disaster, which tells the room he does not fold under pressure even when the magic starts looking ridiculous. Back in the present, the duel's violence gives way to something stranger, because the mentor decides the student needs more than a win. He needs exposure to what real magic feels like. He says he will inject all his experiences into the student so the lesson lands fast, and the student's disbelief is the sane reaction to hearing education described like a magical mugging. The scene shifts to the next part of the training web, where the people around Aster start sorting themselves by status and purpose instead of just throwing power around. The white masked figure and the temple-like setting signal that this is no casual gathering, and the point now is who belongs, who reports, and who gets to speak for the room. In the same larger training flow, a young mage proves the school is not only about smashing things, since healing magic is now part of the curriculum, and it lands on trainees who clearly hate every second of it. That matters because Aster is not just being taught how to fight, he is being pushed into a whole system of magical survival. Then Lady Gamo arrives, and the whole room tightens up around her, because she is clearly the kind of person whose orders get obeyed before anyone finishes thinking about them. Runfit scrambles to answer for the mess. Lady Gamo orders the trainees withdrawn, and the complaint on his face says he already knows this situation is slipping beyond his control. Back in the hall, Lady Gamo keeps control by lowering the tension instead of raising it, setting down the teacup, and speaking like someone who can afford to be calm when everyone else is not. She praises the masked man's combat skill with a smile, which tells Aster the praise here is not just courtesy, it is a test of how he reacts when power notices him. The exchange closes with Callahan stepping in, the vice leader of Declan's Mage Corps, and a red jewel in their machine to address the next problem directly. His mention of apologizing and explaining the magic bullet pushes the scene from social alignment into real faction business, which means Aster is now standing inside House Declan's inner logic, whether he likes it or not. Callahan, Declan's vice leader, and the red jewel in their mage corps explains why the earlier attack mattered so much. The opponent isn't just throwing raw power around, he compresses a magic bullet 4 or 5 times to multiply its force. That tells Aster he is not dealing with a flashy brute, but with someone who has fine control and enough nerve to use it in real combat. Back in the same aftermath, the scale of the fight becomes clear. The trainee has already beaten 5 opponents alone, which means this is a test of talent, not a lucky win. Callahan immediately pivots from praise to planning and calls for Aster to be brought in, because House Declan is deciding what he is worth right now. Aster steps into the conversation like a man being summoned into a room full of knives, and Callahan seats him without bothering to soften the pressure. He answers that he heard the call, then hesitates, because whatever comes next is clearly not small talk, and he knows it. Elsewhere, a young man gets handed a strange golden-framed flower and immediately starts asking the sensible question, is this a gift or a poison trap? The exchange is casual on the surface, but it shows the social world around Aster runs on favors, suspicion, and people smiling while they size each other up. Callahan then pushes the conversation straight at Aster with a proposal, and he catches on fast enough to know this is about more than courtesy. When she brings up the academy, the real stake snaps into focus. They are trying to place him inside a structured path of power before he drifts away again. The offer has a second hook, because Damien likes Aster, and that gives the proposal a personal edge instead of just a political one. Someone close to the situation admits the real fear is that if Aster is forced into the academy, he will bolt again, which means everyone in this room understands exactly how hard he is to pin down. Aster hears the trap in the wording and refuses to be dragged anywhere on anyone else's schedule, and the tension spikes immediately. Callahan stays silent while the moment hangs, then the scene turns stranger and heavier as a transformed figure with impossible powers suddenly appears, forcing everyone to reassess what kind of room this really is. Aster has finally pushed past the academy politics, so the whole room starts leaking out into a deeper lesson. Power here is not just raw talent, but who teaches you, who watches you, and who gets to decide whether you ever leave. That is why the strange parade of faces and reveals matters, because every one of them feels like another piece of the web closing around him. Back in the present, Aster stands in a dim chamber and reaches toward a sealed door, which tells you he is not here for a tour. He is testing a boundary. He keeps his face steady because he already knows the rule of this world. If he wants to build anything bigger than a slum rumor, he needs access, and access always comes with a price. The scene turns into a trial of trust when Aster gets dropped into a ritual circle and the pale-haired mentor figure immediately treats him like a problem to judge. One side wants to pull him in, the other side watches for the moment he bolts, and Aster answers by holding his ground instead of begging to be chosen. That makes the lesson plain for him. People around power do not simply teach, they inspect, measure, and decide whether you are worth keeping. Aster's determination is what stops him from looking like prey, even if the whole arrangement still feels like a trap with paperwork. The thread then shifts into a darker mentor figure, and the setting changes with it. Now Aster is facing a cathedral and a hooded presence inside a darker chamber, which means this is no longer about polite instruction, but about what kind of force can break him before he ever reaches his tower. The hooded figure moves from welcome to attack in the same breath, and Aster immediately learns the real lesson of this new contact. Some teachers test you by trying to crush you. He recoils, gets slammed down, and then grabs back at the attacker's cloak, because survival is still his first language. When the hooded figure's face finally comes into view, the spell behind the trap stops looking random and starts looking deliberate. Aster does not get clarity for free, but he does get a stronger reason to fight back, because whoever this is has both the confidence and the power to make his second life a lot harder. The closing beat widens the mystery one more time, showing another figure in a place that feels like a threshold, and then cutting to a bright, almost mocking burst of confidence from Aster. Whatever the exact exchange is, he is no longer reacting like a hunted stray, because he talks back with enough certainty to suggest he is starting to believe he can outgrow the people trying to corner him. Aster is staring at a divide that matters more than it looks like. One side feels calm and controlled, the other side is still trying to understand what kind of power it is dealing with. That tension carries straight into the next push, because once the spellwork starts opening up, this stops being about guesswork and becomes about who gets to control the knowledge. Elsewhere, the story shifts into a quieter kind of pressure. A figure moves through a garden and reaches the mansion looking relieved, but the calm is thin, because the same scene keeps hinting that peace here is borrowed, not earned. Even the softest setting in this recap still feels like it has teeth. That feeling sharpens into possessiveness when someone makes it clear that the person at the center of all this will not be allowed to belong anywhere else. The empty birdcage says the same thing without needing a speech. Once people get tied to power, freedom is the first thing to walk out. Now the real question lands, and it matters because every secret in the story comes with a price tag. Someone asks what the ulterior motive is. Another figure admits the truth is unreadable, and the answer starts circling around dangerous knowledge that can hurt the person trying to hold it. Back in the present, Aster stops being just the one asking questions and starts becoming the thing that scares people. The magic around him surges hard enough to mark a real transformation, which means the hidden mentor or tester in this thread is no longer dealing with a stray from the black and white district, but with someone who can actually keep up. That shift pulls the story into another confrontational thread, this time with contempt, suspicion, and family politics all tangled together. Callahan, Declan's vice leader of the Mage Corps and the Red Jewel, speaks with a kind of dismissiveness that makes small people feel replaceable, and the black and white district gets written off like the whole place was never supposed to matter. Conveniently, that sort of attitude usually means someone has already been noticed. The pressure snaps into a new reveal when a man kneels before the magical circle and realizes he has been found out. That is the danger of digging too deep around power like this. The moment you think you are hidden, somebody else is already moving the board underneath you. The Heavenly Origin art sits at the center of this mess, the Declan family's root technique and the kind of secret that turns knowledge into a weapon. Aster does not care about the history lesson for its own sake, because for him it means every scrap of forbidden magic is another step towards surviving the people who already killed him once. Inside the magic circle, the tension finally turns personal. Someone confesses he could not stop chasing this power, and Aster hears the same kind of obsession that gets people buried under House Declan's kennel of loyal killers, which is exactly why he stays cold and focused instead of being impressed by the theatrics. Then the theory becomes a fight, because magical research in this world is never just research once someone decides to use it. The spell unfolds with enough force to overwhelm its target, and that tells Aster one simple thing. The new Heavenly Source art is not a rumor or a hobby. It is dangerous enough to hurt people who think they understand it. Back at the ritual circle, the conversation shifts from raw power to who gets to own it. One side says the problem is not the research itself, but the acquisition, which means this is about control, theft, and who gets to decide what House Declan is allowed to keep hidden. Aster calls out the shamelessness of it all, because he knows exactly what kind of game this is. People smiling across a table while they measure each other for a knife. He does not soften the accusation either, and that matters because Aster is already too deep in these family games to pretend this is polite conversation. The pressure in the room keeps building as another man stands there gasping. Someone else appears out of nowhere with that eerie magic user confidence, and the whole space starts to feel like a trap that has already closed. Meanwhile, the desk is a disaster of papers, books, and a sealed envelope, which is usually how a secret tries to look innocent right before it ruins somebody's day. The letter finally puts a name on the bait. It is addressed to Aster. That turns the whole exchange from abstract research into a direct summons, because now somebody is not just studying forbidden magic around him, they are reaching for him personally. Aster gets the letter open and finds exactly what he expected and feared. Someone is no longer circling him politely, they are putting a message in his hands. In a world where House Declan hunts anyone who runs, a written summons is never just paper, it is a hook. Instead of treating the warning like treasure, Aster tears the letter apart and kills the discussion before it can grow teeth. That tells you how he survives now. He does not wait for a trap to explain itself. He breaks the note and keeps moving. Now the tower stops being a place to stash books and becomes Aster's statement to everyone watching him. He chooses identity over convenience, which means the tower is not just shelter anymore, it is the shape of his revenge. Back in the present, the talk shifts to Aster himself, and the way people speak about him makes it clear he is already drawing dangerous curiosity. One voice shrugs at death like it is a minor paperwork error, while the next admits the threat was meant as a test, which means Aster is being measured by people who would happily break him if he fails. In the next chamber, a white-robed mage starts a ritual and pushes the story from talk into active magic training. Aster is no longer just hearing theories about power, he is standing inside the machinery that teaches people how to use it. That pressure finally eases into movement as one woman thanks a man and tells him to go, while another outside the estate hurries things along. The point is simple, the conversation is over, and the next conflict zone is waiting whether Aster likes it or not. Aster reaches Damien at the doorway and gives him a blunt send-off, which matters because Damien is now being left on his own at exactly the wrong kind of threshold. The masked stranger and the formal guest reactions nearby only underline it. Everybody in this place is watching who leaves, who stays, and who says yes when they are asked. Then the magic training pays off in a rush of concrete progress, as water or another magical substance bursts into shape and Aster starts directing power with his own hand. He can feel the subspace tomes working through him now, and the red aura around him says the lesson is no longer theoretical, which is bad news for anyone hoping he stays a harmless little slum problem. Henzi's curriculum turns out to be tied straight to the Declan family's heavenly source art, which means Aster is not just learning magic, he is stepping into the same bloodline machinery that once crushed people like the Blando family. That kind of discovery does not stay academic for long. It points him toward bigger conflicts, bigger enemies, and a power system built to reward the people who already own the table. The mood snaps from revelation into motion as Aster reacts to the chance in front of him, and then barrels out into the city with purpose. He is not lingering to admire the lesson, because a second life only matters if he uses it to get somewhere before Declan closes the net again. The carriage ride reaches its limit, so the group has to split here, with one last farewell hanging in the air before everyone goes their own way. Aster is already being pushed back into the wider world, and even the goodbye feels like a checkpoint in the larger fight, rather than a soft farewell. Aster spots someone he trusts enough to call friend, and that small moment of relief immediately gets undercut by his worry that the entrance ceremony will leave them with no seats. He is thinking ahead now, which is what survival looks like when every official event can turn into a trap or a snub. Back on the move, Aster pushes forward with a kind of urgency that says he has already decided not to be left behind. He keeps correcting himself in the moment, because what matters to him is not the pretty version of events, but the real route to power and the people still waiting on him. Now the story shifts into formal territory, with Aster looking like he is walking into the kind of place where every pause gets judged. He moves from excitement into calculation, then into a harder realization, because the closer he gets to the next conflict, the less room he has to pretend this is simple. Elsewhere in the same flow of events, an older man is rattled enough to ask what is wrong, while Aster checks on a light-haired person and keeps moving through the crowd. The social game is already getting sharper, and the important part is not the greeting itself, but who notices whom before the next confrontation starts. Aster passes through an ornate hall with two others, and the setting alone makes it clear he has entered a more controlled, more political space. Then the older man finally sees something off and asks the obvious question about the stains on his clothes, which turns a simple walk into the opening of a much uglier problem. The tension spikes as a straining man drops low under pressure, then a magical udar tears through the exchange between the two sides. Aster is now in the part of the story where strength is not theoretical anymore, because every reaction around him says someone is getting forced to answer for being in the wrong place. That clash does not resolve cleanly, so someone tries to stop the situation right there and asks for a cutoff before it gets worse. But the next question lands immediately after that. The bandaged man wants to know who is standing in front of him, which means identity itself is becoming the next weapon in the room. The final turn widens the conflict instead of closing it, because a tall white-haired man takes the elevated position and leaves the two figures below him on edge. Aster is no longer dealing with a single meeting or a single argument. He is being drawn into a hierarchy where every face in the room is measuring what he is worth. The room stops pretending this is a conversation the moment the tension snaps, because the first man makes it clear he would rather fight than explain himself. The others answer with a tight, ugly agreement, which tells Aster he is not facing one isolated hothead, but a small group already moving as a unit. Then the pressure shifts into a direct challenge. One man barks for control, another demands to know what everyone is doing, and that is really the point of the scene. Somebody is trying to seize the rhythm before Aster does, because in a place like this, whoever asks the questions first usually decides who gets cornered. The exchange escalates into real magical posturing, with both sides showing off just enough power to make the others hesitate. The stakes are simple now. Back down, or prove you belong in this hierarchy by surviving the first serious test. Aster does not flinch, and that calm is its own threat, so the room answers by measuring him the hard way. He keeps his face steady, gathers power, and squares up, which tells everyone present he is not here to plead for a place at the table. Not from a noble family, maybe, but that only matters if he loses. The first real hit lands, and it is meant to settle the argument by force. Aster takes the blow, gets driven back, and then throws out his own counterattack, which proves he is still dangerous even when the other side gets the first clean opening. Back in the same fight, the attack turns darker because the enemy is not done revealing what he brought to the room. He warns Aster there are two opponents, not one, and that forces the whole clash to widen from a simple duel into a trap with backup. Also, for a guy who was already throwing hands, announcing extra help is a bold way to make things worse for everyone involved. That is when the scene pivots into a heavier magical escalation, with demonic imagery and specialized power finally coming into play. The red mask, the demon helm, the blue lightning, and the downward strike all say the same thing. This is no longer about talk or bravado. It is about which side can push the other past its limit first. Aster answers with force of his own, and the impact tells him this fight is now testing what kind of monster he can become without losing himself. Aster stops treating this like a straight brawl and answers the pressure with a violent upward counter, because surviving House Declan's hunt means he has to break their rhythm before they bury him. The exchange turns into raw power trading, and that matters because this fight is now deciding who gets forced onto the back foot first, not who throws the prettier spell. Back in the fight center, the cost shows up fast. One side surprised, the other side being hurled away, and the structure around them taking the punishment for both. Aster is learning the ugly lesson of mage combat here, which is that every boost in power also makes the battlefield itself start failing around him. One fighter grins through the violence and keeps pressing, while another bursts up with a sudden surge that says he refuses to fold yet. Aster answers by driving the enemy down from above, and the follow-through proves he is willing to use lethal-looking force if that is what it takes to keep moving toward revenge. The drop leaves the loser staring into the dark and asking, in plain terms, whether fear is finally winning. That beat matters, because the fight is no longer about talent alone. It is about whether anyone here can keep his nerve once the power starts eating the confidence off his face. Instead of collapsing into pure panic, the younger pair dig in and shout each other forward, because this battle has become a test of who can stay committed when the first hit lands hard. Aster crouches low and gets ready to answer that push, while the other side tries to force a decisive break with a bigger exchange than before. As the magic keeps exploding, the scene shifts from pure survival into wider Academy faction pressure, because power like this always attracts people who want to measure, recruit, or control it. Aster now has to stay calm under that attention and keep his footing, since one sloppy move here would hand both the fight and his reputation to somebody else. Aster's first real break comes when the pressure around him turns into applause, because in this Academy world, power is never just power. The crowd starts reacting to the people who can stand out, and that means Aster is no longer fighting only to survive, he is being measured for what kind of problem he might become. Back in the present, Aster stays locked in with the next group of figures as the mood around him sharpens from excitement into suspicion. Their reactions make the situation plain. This is the part where the Academy starts sorting people into allies, rivals, and future headaches, and Aster has to keep his face steady or get filed into the wrong drawer. A white-haired academic type calls someone forward with the kind of enthusiasm that usually means trouble is about to become official. That call matters because once a person is singled out in a room like this, the scene stops being about general talent and starts being about who gets chosen, who gets judged, and who gets embarrassed in public. Inside a formal room, the older men are already discussing what Aster's presence means, and the stern look on one face tells the viewer this is not casual small talk. The question behind it is simple. Did he really do what people say he did? Or is everyone already rewriting his reputation before he even speaks? Another watcher, the one with headphones around his neck and magic crackling close by, keeps the conversation moving by treating Aster like a case study instead of a person. That is the real danger here, because once the Academy starts asking whether someone is worthy of entrance, it is no longer just about talent, it is about who controls the gate. Back in the hall, Aster leans in toward the seated woman, while everyone else tries to pretend they are not watching him. His little ahem is not polite so much as tactical, because he needs attention on his terms before the room decides what his second life is supposed to be. The woman answers plainly, and that keeps the exchange from turning into theater for long. What follows is the important part. People are already arguing over whether her skills were good enough to get her through the entrance at all, which means Aster is standing right in the middle of the Academy's usual habit of turning talent into a courtroom drama. Aster has already won himself a second life, but that only buys him a front row seat to the Academy's real game. Every fight, every favor, and every rumor now matters, because House Declan is still hunting anyone who slips its leash. In the present, the tension snaps into a test of force, and Aster gets dragged into it because standing still in this place is basically volunteering to get stepped on. The clash tells him the same thing his old death did. Power here is not a speech, it is a weapon people use to decide who gets to enter. When someone refuses to answer, the pressure shifts off the fistfight and into the social knife fight the Academy loves so much. Aster is now in the middle of people demanding explanations, because every silence here looks like a scheme, and every scheme attracts witnesses. That suspicion turns practical fast, because information is already changing hands, and somebody is clearly trying to control what gets said next. The room stops being about manners and starts being about leverage, which is how these people say they are threatening you without raising their voices. Then the whole mood lightens for a second as Aster gets greeted like an old friend, and the scene uses that warmth to show how fast relationships can matter in a place built on rank. Even the blunt question about a roommate reminds him that this world runs on tiny domestic details as much as grand titles, which is annoying in a very efficient way. Back in the city, Aster and his companion take in the capital scale, and his shock makes the point better than any lecture. This place is far beyond the slums he came from. The lake, the unfamiliar architecture, and the statue all tell him he is standing inside a world with resources, history, and ambitions big enough to dwarf his old life. That matters because Aster is not sightseeing for free. He is measuring the city, its symbols, and its power so he can build his own tower someday. And even a casual walk becomes reconnaissance when your enemies still own most of the board. Elsewhere, Declan is already under watch, which means the conflict has moved from personal revenge to coordinated operation. Someone on the other side is trying to decide who gets blamed for the growing unrest, and Professor Perun's local connections make him an easy name to throw around. As night deepens, the city stops pretending it is at rest. Magical signs flare on the lampposts, a hooded mage drops out of the dark, and the first strike lands hard enough to remind everyone that the surveillance around Declan is not just gossip anymore, it is the opening move of a real operation. On the rooftop, House Declan's operatives finally make contact, and the little exchange tells you everything. This is a coordinated hunt, not a random brawl. One of them immediately checks whether the others are in position, because if the team is split now, the whole operation starts to wobble. The next question is the dangerous one, because the target mix is no longer clean. They ask whether they are after the main target or the sub-targets, then hear that the main target's trail has already been stepped on and the operation is exposed, which means the enemy knows they are in play. Back in the same operation, the reported main target moves after orders reach the field, and the surveillance subject among the sub-targets turns out to be Professor Perun, the local academic whose connections make him useful and dangerous at the same time. That forces the operatives to ask for serious reinforcement, because this is no longer a clean shadow job. The answer comes back hard. No number one, no single number backup either, for a beat that hits like a dead end, because the team has been stripped down to whatever is already on the board, and that is never a comforting sentence in a Declan operation. Then the mood flips when they announce Callahan, Declan's vice leader of the Mage Corps and the Red Jewel, is joining the operation. The alarm in their voices makes the point plain. If Callahan shows up, this stops being a routine watch and starts looking like a statement. Callahan would be enough on his own, but that is exactly why the others hesitate. They start thinking the matter may not have to escalate into open conflict, and that small relief tells you how badly they wanted to avoid dragging the whole city into a louder fight. That strategic breathing room does not last. Once the operation settles into its next phase, figures drop toward the city below, and the watching side has to look up and realize the pressure is moving from rumor to impact. As the reveal sharpens, Callahan's masked demonic look makes his real role impossible to miss. He is not just another soldier, he is a fear weapon with a reputation attached. Declan brings him in because loyalty alone is not enough anymore. It needs a display of force that people will remember. The scene shifts into the Grand Cathedral, where Callahan stands before a seated authority and then before a throne, and that tells you this is about rank as much as battle. He proves his loyalty in the most political way possible, by kneeling where it benefits him and letting power decide what he becomes next. Then the old fire inside him takes over, and Callahan's true prime starts to emerge through the flames, which means the mask is not the whole story. Aster, watching with that hard, stubborn focus, understands the real lesson here. Declan is bringing out its monsters on purpose, and he will need more than survival instincts to answer them. Outside that violence, the night keeps its own record, and the crescent moon and handwritten notes remind you that someone is still collecting evidence and thinking ahead. The notebook matters because this war is not only being fought with spells, but with names, roots, and whatever truth someone can pin to paper before the next strike lands. Under the full moon, Aster finds the fight widening beyond a simple brawl. Two masked figures step into the night, and the message is clear. House Declan is no longer just chasing him, it is sending in people who know how to turn one man's second life into a public execution. Then the pressure turns physical fast. One fighter reaches for the power overhead, another snaps a spell into place, and the whole exchange says the same thing in different ways. This is no ordinary hunt. This is Declan flexing magical muscle to pin Aster down before he can run. The kind of subtlety here is dead on arrival. Aster does not get the luxury of hesitation. He gets slammed, left stunned near the monument, and the moment matters because it shows what Declan wants from him. Not a fair duel, just a body on the ground, and a lesson to anyone else thinking of leaving the kennel. Inside that pressure, the scene twists toward the first real reveal of intent. A masked figure's eyes turn vicious, and Aster comes across a glowing artifact on the floor, which means the battlefield is now handing him a weapon or a trap, and he has to decide in a heartbeat which one it is. Aster chooses violence with the object instead of caution, and the result is a blast big enough to rewrite the room. That explosion does more than create damage, because it forces everyone involved to reveal their real footing. Aster can still improvise under pressure, and the people around him are now fighting for control of the aftermath instead of the opening. Back in the same battle, the confrontation stops pretending to be a chase and becomes a direct test of identity. Aster ends up face to face with an opponent who talks like a smug noble and laughs like this is the best day he's had all week, which tells you everything about the kind of threat he is dealing with. Someone who enjoys getting hit almost as much as hitting back. Meanwhile, Callahan steps into the same escalation with a veteran's confidence and a very personal temper. He calls out from the tech blue field, powers himself up, and drives the fight into a heavier magical exchange. So now the question is no longer whether Aster can survive the clash, but whether he can survive being dragged into the middle of stronger people settling their scores. By the end, Callahan is still standing in the wreckage, and he finally names what this costs him politically. He calls Pola out and says that from now on, he will think of Aster as a mercenary before a student, which is a cold way of admitting that Aster has forced everyone to stop treating him like a runaway and start treating him like a serious piece on the board. Aster takes the first hard step into this escalation by answering with a quiet yes, which matters because he is no longer hesitating in front of Declan's people. Then he draws a blade marked with magic, the kind of weapon that says this fight is not about pride anymore, it is about surviving the people who keep trying to own him. Back in the Grand Plaza arena, the duel stops being a private grudge and starts looking like a public execution waiting to happen. One side even sneers about a document envelope from Blando Trash, which tells you the old noble feuds are now bleeding straight into the fight, and nobody here is above dragging paperwork into murder. Then the tempo snaps upward as the combatants stop testing each other and start throwing power around like they want the whole district to remember their names. One mage is already grinning through the heat, and that smile says the real danger is not just skill, it is how much these people enjoy turning damage into a hobby. That attitude pays off in a brutal way, because the exchange turns into a full display of magical force instead of a clean duel. Once the wings, the spell patterns, and the massive blast come out, the fight stops being personal and becomes proof that the players on the field are far beyond ordinary students or street troublemakers. Callahan, Declan's vice leader, and one of the people who can turn a battlefield into a disaster, answers by going fully feral in fire. He does not just show strength here, he announces that Aster and everyone near him are now dealing with a man who has decided restraint is for someone else. The conflict then widens into something much uglier, because another mage brings out freezing power while the assault starts reaching castles instead of opponents. Once Aster is watching from the wall and the towered buildings begin taking direct hits, the message is simple. This is no longer a duel. It is a city-level war with collateral damage baked in. From there, the story pushes into the occult side of the mess, with a demonic presence, a cryptic lineup of figures, and a battlefield that is now so chaotic it reads like several factions colliding at once. Aster stays locked into it, because the bigger this gets, the more his revenge, his tower, and his chances of surviving Declan all depend on him not getting swallowed by the chaos. A hooded mage tries to brush off Callahan's pressure like it is beneath him, but that attitude lasts about one heartbeat before the battlefield starts answering back. The attack keeps chewing through the ground, and his frustration makes the real point clear. Nobody here gets to act superior once the spell work turns this violent. Then the fight stops feeling like a skirmish and starts looking like a summoning disaster because a massive magical creature rises into the mess and forces everyone to react at once. In this kind of war, one extra monster is not a twist, it is a tax on survival. Callahan, the Declan Mage Corps vice leader, answers by throwing out power big enough to matter across the city instead of just in front of her face. That move turns the whole district into collateral, which is exactly what happens when nobles decide subtlety can die first. Amid the wreckage, another fighter gives Aster a grudging nod because he actually keeps up instead of folding. That matters because trust in this mess is not emotional, it is tactical, and Aster earns a little more of it by proving he can survive the same chaos as the people already standing. Back in the present fight, Aster pushes his own mana harder, and the next exchange shows why his second life matters. He is not just hanging on anymore, he is trying to dominate the flow of the battle. Someone offers power in absurdly broad terms, but in a war like this, limitless power is less a gift than a temptation with teeth. Aster commits to a full spell through a ritual circle, and when an attack comes for him, he answers with the kind of confidence that only appears when retreat is off the table. The control struggle finally lands where it should have all along, on the question of who owns the battlefield instead of who merely stands in it. The fight then spreads beyond one duel, because the red-haired Callahan gets swallowed by flame, a blue-aligned force shows up, and multiple spell circles start tearing into one another. At that point, the city is no longer a backdrop, it is the thing being dismantled while the combatants gamble over who gets to keep standing when the dust clears. The pressure spikes again as one combatant gets hammered by repeated blue bursts, then somehow remains standing long enough to laugh through the wreckage and throw another massive spell into the mix. That tells the viewer everything they need to know. This is not a clean victory path, it is a contest of who breaks first under the strain. Aster gets dragged into that same nightmare of force, vortex, and shockwave, and the city keeps paying for every second he stays in the game. By the end, he is still upright on ruined ground, crackling with power, and surrounded by debris that floats as if the battlefield itself has lost its footing around him. Aster stays planted in the middle of the wreckage, and that stillness is the real threat, because it means the next person to move has to do it under his terms. Then the enemy answer comes from above with a brutal rain of stacked attacks, the kind of opening that is meant to overwhelm a mage before he can even pick a direction. Back in the same ruined city block, Aster slips through the first wave just enough to keep breathing, while the surviving fighters scramble to count who is still in the fight. The mood turns ugly fast. When someone starts asking how many troublemakers are left, it usually means the cleanup is about to get personal. Aster answers the pressure with a surprise counter, forcing the battle from panic into a straight-up contest of endurance. He throws up a red-lit defense and then drives back upward, which tells everyone watching that this is no longer a quick ambush. It is a city-level war where nobody gets to stay hidden for long. Still in the devastated street, Callahan, Declan's Red Jewel vice leader, steps in and tries to crush the fight with raw force. Instead, both sides lock into a hard standoff, and his disbelief makes the point clearer than any lecture. Aster is surviving power that should have erased him already. The clash tightens into a close-range finish, and Callahan finally commits to ending it right there. But the strain shows on him too, because once a fight reaches this level, victory stops being about style and starts being about who can keep their body and magic from giving out first. Now the battle rolls straight into the next exchange, with the finishing sequence turning into a brutal chain of follow-ups instead of a clean win. One fighter keeps pressing with a red-bladed strike, another eats the blast and answers with layered defense, and the whole thing proves the same ugly truth as the rest of this war. Everyone here is spending more power than they can afford. Callahan finally pushes the exchange into its finishing phase, and the blast he unleashes is so violent, it looks like he may have won on raw force alone. But the aftermath answers the real question. This fight is not ending cleanly, because the enemy side still has tricks hidden under the smoke. Inside the fire, a rune flashes and the answer starts to show itself. Callahan survives long enough to come out of the wreckage, then crouches and immediately wonders if he actually finished the job, which is what happens when a battle gets so messy nobody trusts what they just saw. Back in the same ruined battlefield, the enemy drops in with the kind of timing that ruins a victory speech before it starts. Callahan answers by staying calm and raising his hand again, because if he hesitates here, the whole opening burst he paid for goes to waste. The duel widens into a test of survival, not style. Aster, the masked mage who came here to keep climbing and keep revenge alive, steps in like the whole point of the fight is to remind everyone he is still standing after all of it. That defense matters because a surprise hit like this should have dropped anyone ordinary. The narration makes the stakes plain. Aster's reputation is real, his judgment is fast, and Callahan's last spell only works because Aster barely threads the needle in time. Then the balance flips. Callahan gets driven back and knocked down, and the fight stops looking like a duel between equals, and starts looking like Aster has finally found the opening he was hunting for. Aster closes the distance with that cold, controlled confidence that usually shows up right before somebody has a very bad afternoon. He fires back with lightning, calls Callahan a rat, and lands the kind of punishment that turns swagger into damage control. With the wall ruined behind him, Aster stands his ground and makes the one claim that matters here. He is not some trained fighting cock put on display for other people's games. He answers with power in his own hand, which means this battle is no longer about surviving the ambush, but about proving who gets to define himself after it. Aster, the masked troublemaker who clawed his way up from the slums, lets the mask slip just enough to show the blue-eyed glare underneath. He is no longer guessing whether he can stand in this fight, because the answer is written all over the way he squares up and brings his weapon to bear. Still in the duel, Aster keeps the pressure on and pushes his power upward instead of waiting to be pinned down again. That matters because he is not just trying to hit back, he is trying to control the pace so House Declan cannot drag him into their preferred little execution theater. The fight turns from brute force into information as Aster tears into a document and forces the scene toward what is written, not just what is thrown at him. The message is simple. He is not playing defense anymore. He is hunting for the truth behind the attack. A mage on the other side spells out the next layer of the problem by unveiling books anyone can read and a communication crystal, which means this is bigger than one private grudge. Aster's world is widening fast, and the ugly joke is that even the paperwork has to become a weapon now. Because the duel is no longer just about survival. The fallout starts to spill into school politics and public judgment. What looks like one man's brawl is really a test of who gets to keep a clean reputation while everyone else gets dragged into the mud. In the school setting, a man quietly admits he only wanted company, which softens the mood just enough to make the next exchange feel loaded. Aster's side of the conversation shifts from combat to suspicion, because when people start talking like that, somebody is usually hiding the real reason they showed up. The memory gap snaps into focus when the boy realizes he has forgotten something important, and that hit of panic turns the calm atmosphere into a problem again. The point is not the missing detail itself, but the fact that whatever was lost still has enough weight to change the whole conversation. Back in the present, Aster keeps the pressure on by asking the woman his name while she watches from above, and that forces the scene into formal judgment instead of raw fighting. Her face going hard tells him the easy part is over, because now the people with rank are deciding what his second life is worth. The school and its rules matter here, since they are the gate between Aster and the power he needs. Aster is still under formal judgment, and the first thing that matters is who in the room holds the power to name him. The blue-eyed judge stays unreadable while the woman reacts like she just heard a verdict she does not like, which tells Aster this is no longer a scuffle. It is a ranking of what his life is worth. The woman is then forced to stand before the seated judges in the amphitheater, and the shock on her face turns into the ugly part of authority, where embarrassment starts looking a lot like punishment. Another observer cuts in with a cold, knowing read on the situation, and the message is simple. They recognize something in Aster that changes the room's mood. Her distress spikes fast, because whatever is being judged is not abstract anymore. It has left marks on her body and reputation. The torn clothing and the strange name mark on the floor push the scene from polite scrutiny into proof, the kind that makes a formal hearing feel like a trap with better seating. Aster keeps forcing the issue from below, and that pressure cracks the room open enough for the judges to answer him instead of ignoring him. The woman turns toward the amphitheater full of seated figures like she is bracing for a sentence, which means the Academy's rules are now deciding whether Aster gets a path forward or gets buried under procedure. The discussion shifts into the Academy's real business, books, tests, and the part where everybody pretends this is all civilized. Aster is being measured, confused, and asked to speak for himself, because in this place power only counts once it gets translated into proof. That pressure lands hard on the people around him, and suddenly the emotional cost shows up as tears instead of argument. Aster is no longer just a survivor being watched, he is becoming the center of a room full of people who do not agree on what he is supposed to be. Back in the Academy instruction, the lesson becomes brutally clear. A mage has to keep control of himself or other people will write his story for him. The meditation and formal training are not just techniques, they are the gate between raw talent and the kind of power Aster needs if he wants revenge and a tower that lasts. Now the scene moves into the assembly chamber, where the Academy starts acting like the small kingdom it really is. Aster enters under the weight of shadowed figures, the red flare of force flashes up, and the room immediately proves that this place runs on pressure, status, and who can make the others blink first. That tension spreads through the hall as reactions ripple out in every direction, and the politics turn personal fast. Callahan, Declan's vice leader of the Mage Corps, and the red jewel of their side, moves with the kind of confidence that tells everyone else to get out of her way or get burned by the paperwork later. The Academy's control system ends on a hard practical note. A glowing crystal orb gives the room a clean official answer, which is exactly why nobody trusts it completely. Aster is still getting assessed, but the real result is that he is now inside the machinery of school politics, and that machinery is already pointing him toward his next fight. Inside the Academy's controlled training space, the lesson starts with a simple rule. If you can handle the device, you can keep up with this world. Callahan, Declan's red-haired vice leader of the Mage Corps, spells it out for Aster because nobody here is getting handed power for free. Aster does what he is told, and pours mana into the crystal orb, turning a clean instruction into a full magical test. The result is loud, dramatic, and a little embarrassing for anyone who thought this would be a polite classroom exercise. Callahan then shows why the device matters. Its center is the key, and touching it is enough to force the next stage open. The summoning circle answers, something arrives, and the room stops being about lessons and becomes about whether the people here are actually ready for what they have invoked. That jump in power carries into the refinement process, where the whole point is to push the device until it reveals how far someone can really go. One person admits they are stuck, another asks whether they should proceed, and then the refinement level hits 6, which means the room is no longer guessing at potential and is staring straight at it. Back in the present, Aster is now standing inside that same web of magical control and pressure, watching who can handle the system and who cannot. He knows this kind of place decides futures, and for him that means survival first, revenge later, and no luxury of being impressed for too long. When the onlookers spot the dark-haired young master of the Blando family, the Academy's calm finally cracks into real tension. Aster's own memory locks onto the fact that this is the boy who liked beating him the most. So the scene stops being about abstract training and turns into a very personal accounting of old cruelty. Aster is still inside the Academy's pressure cooker, where every lesson doubles as a warning that power here is measured, watched, and never free. He has survived long enough to know that this place decides who rises and who gets ground down, so the next few tests matter because they show what kind of strength he can actually claim for himself. The students push into controlled spell work, and one revelation lands hard. The Blando family's monster did not come out of nowhere. It was made by the same kind of rotten history that keeps eating noble houses from the inside. That matters because Aster is not just learning magic anymore. He is learning how the Academy turns old damage into new power, which is exactly the kind of system he plans to outlive. The training escalates into a blunt little contest of strength and control, with one side pressing forward and the other refusing to fold. The point is not who looks flashy, it is who can keep their nerve when the room starts turning into a test nobody can fake their way through. Elsewhere in the Academy, the politics are just as ugly as the magic. A female instructor looks out over the city, stares at her paperwork, and then snaps at the workload and the people around her, which tells you this place runs on exhaustion as much as talent. The Academy's hidden machinery comes into view next, because the real lesson is not a spell, but the system built around it. Different figures are shown in parallel as power surges, creatures are summoned, and another spell kicks off between them, all of it pointing to the same thing. This school is manufacturing ability, and everybody involved is trying to decide who gets to control the results. Tiny details still somehow the entire semester. Back with Aster, the noise drops away and the story narrows to what he has personally built so far. He focuses, turns aside, and handles the objects in his hands, while thinking about the month he has already spent in secret training, because survival here depends on work nobody else gets to see. Aster then makes the next part of his plan plain. The training room is only one piece of what he is building. He is working on more than one front now, which means his revenge, his tower, and whatever hidden project he is keeping quiet are all moving at the same time. Aster quietly converts the Blando family elixir with his mana, which matters because he is not just collecting loot, he is learning how to turn enemy resources into his own advantage. He also remembers grabbing a useful ledge at the academy and picking up another item there, the kind of small theft that keeps a broke survivor one step ahead of richer people with better manners. Back in Aster's hands, that braided cord stops being a random accessory and becomes something dangerous the moment he wraps it around himself. The instant it answers his magic, he realizes it is tied to Declan's secret grimoire, so the problem is no longer finding power, but surviving what power wakes up when he touches the wrong thing. From there, the story widens into the Academy's library, where the upper, middle, and lower divisions make the rules feel less like scholarship and more like a locked staircase. Aster is now dealing with a system built to sort people by access, and that means every hidden book, device, or favor can become a weapon before he ever throws a spell. Aster pushes into plant-based magic next, asking for vine seeds and getting them in a formal setting where even the reply sounds half dismissive. When the magic finally takes, the shock on everyone around him makes the point plain. He is not just studying theory, he is proving he can force new forms of power to obey him. Then the test environment snaps into view, with a glowing numbered maze turning the whole thing into a public evaluation instead of a private experiment. Aster is now being measured in front of other people, and that matters because he cannot build a tower or plan revenge if the Academy decides he is too useful, too dangerous, or too inconvenient to keep around. Outside, Aster turns to Damien with a proposition, and that shifts the scene from simple training into alliance building. He is no longer only trying to survive the next spell test, because now he is looking for people who can help him move against House Declan and keep his larger plan alive. Aster is already past the point of subtlety now, standing over a fallen opponent with that nasty little smile that says he has learned exactly how far he can push people before they break. Then the room flips from tension to spectacle as three figures arrive in a burst of magic, and the whole thing turns into a public test of status, money, and who gets to act like they own the floor. The new arrivals start haggling over bracelets like they are buying bread, but the numbers immediately expose a problem. Someone is trying to shortchange the others, and the authority figure has to step in and force the math back into reality. That matters because Aster is not just watching a silly argument here, he is seeing how this world handles power, and the answer is with correction, pressure, and a very thin smile. The deal stops being a deal when anger spreads through the group and one of them raises a spell, only for everyone to freeze once the situation turns serious. Aster then walks straight through the crowd and tells them to pretend they heard nothing, which is his way of saying he controls the room now, not them. When the young masters try to save face and ask where he is going, the authority figure snaps back at being called after, and that tiny mistake gives away the whole balance of the exchange. Aster closes his hand around the bracelet with an ugly little grin, because the real win here is not the object itself, but the fact that he just forced everyone else to swallow the insult. Elsewhere, back in a more controlled setting, an older man sits at an ornate desk surrounded by magical spheres, which means the story has shifted from street-level posturing to the people who actually coordinate the bigger machinery. That shift matters because Aster's rise is no longer just about raw talent. Now it is pulling in logistics, observation, and people who treat spellwork like an operation instead of a hobby. The next step is pure infrastructure. A warp portal opens between two groups, then stabilizes with layers of magic until the system announces it is complete. In plain terms, somebody has built a controlled way to move power, people, or information across distance, and that is the sort of tool that can either help Aster build his tower, or get him buried under the people trying to stop him. Once the portal is live, the internal feed switches on, and the watcher starts seeing what is happening inside, where figures work with orbs and ritual circles to begin the scoring process. That means this is not random magic anymore. It is evaluation, and Aster is now being measured by systems that care a lot about results and very little about his feelings. Back in the active trial, Aster gets hammered by a brutal magical strike and sent crashing down. But the important part is not the hit itself, it is that he keeps getting back up and keeps channeling power anyway. The young man watching him even sounds impressed, because Aster is now looking less like a stray troublemaker and more like someone who recruits strength fast enough to scare people. With the dust settling, Aster stands over the defeated opponent, and the official slaps him with a 320 gold fine for arrogance, which is a very fancy way of saying his mouth is costing him money. Aster answers by pulling magic back together again, because for him the punishment is not a warning to behave, it is just another reason to keep climbing. The fight stops being a bruising argument and turns into a real threat when the other side starts screaming retaliation instead of backing down. Aster does not get the luxury of a clean win here, because the moment someone swears revenge in a mage fight, that usually means more trouble is already on the way. Back in the slums, Aster hits the ugly part of a second life. Strength is useless if he cannot even figure out who will back him up next. He worries about needing another professor to recommend him, then literally bites down on his own hand like a man trying to chew through a bad decision. Now the story shifts to an older stone building, where Aster refuses the safe choice and pushes himself back into motion. He talks himself into action instead of overthinking, because every delay is just another chance for Declan's people to catch up. That choice pays off immediately. Aster forces magic into the open and discovers he is no longer dealing with ordinary resistance. He even snaps at the situation like a survivor with a mouth on him, asking if this counts as cheating, which is fair because the response looks less like training and more like somebody calling reinforcements from the basement of bad ideas. The pressure climbs fast, and now someone is begging for the attacks to stop while the blast radius keeps doing its own thing. Then the real problem shows up. One opponent accuses the other of betrayal. So this is not just a fight anymore, it is a dirty family of grudges tearing itself open in public. Aster spots a bracelet acting up and realizes his own power is getting dragged into something he does not fully control. He folds under the strain for a second, then steels himself anyway, because this is the point where panic either breaks him or teaches him what kind of mage he has become. Elsewhere, the crisis spills past Aster and lands on the students, which means the whole place is now in danger instead of just the people in the fight. He heads toward a skull-marked doorway with the usual warning hanging in the air, and then a summoned armored creature proves that somebody on the other side came prepared to make this ugly. Now the threat widens from a duel into a massacre in the making, with a death threat aimed straight at the students. Callahan steps in and shuts it down, but the answer is a fresh power surge and a giant presence waking up, so the only thing worse than the danger itself is how quickly it starts spreading. The crisis stops being a private duel the second that giant thing wakes up, because now Aster is not just fighting for himself, he is standing in the path of a disaster that can chew through the students' necks, and that is a very different kind of problem. Aster tries to hold the line, but the exchange turns ugly fast, with the whole space filling up with too many fighters, too much panic, and one very obvious fact: somebody planned this mess. Even the armored construct is not the real story anymore, because the control system has been tampered with, which means the danger is deliberate and still spreading. Back in the corridor, Aster stops running like a victim and starts moving like a problem, pushing into his own power instead of waiting to be saved. He throws purple magic at the threat, gets smashed back for it, and that hit tells everyone watching the same thing. If he wants revenge, a tower, or even a tomorrow, he has to survive this first. Aster gets back up with his jaw set, and the mood around him changes with it. His eyes lock in, his uniform comes into view, and he looks less like a kid stumbling into trouble and more like the kind of mage who refuses to fold even when the situation is already on fire. That resolve turns into a direct strike. Aster drops into attack posture and brings the pressure down hard, which proves he is no longer just reacting to the crisis, he is answering it on his own terms. Now Aster starts saying the quiet part out loud. He is already marked as the target, so the best way to keep everyone else alive is to pull the enemy's eyes onto himself. He walks away with that cold, stubborn confidence that only comes from somebody who has died once already, and is done being polite about it. The wider cast finally snaps into the same conflict, with one side shaken, another standing ready, and the room turning into a pressure cooker of fear and resolve. Then the scene lands on the ugliest question underneath all of it. After everything he has lost, is there anyone else out there like Aster at all, or is he the only one stupid enough to keep standing? Aster realizes the fight has tipped into the dangerous part now. One mistake and the enemy gets time to complete something ugly, so he steps in before they can settle, forcing the next exchange to be about pressure, not patience. The wide-brimmed figure stands over the wreckage and starts begging the spell to hold, which tells you this is not a clean victory yet, but a desperate gamble. The magic keeps building, trapping someone in its range, and the whole thing hangs on whether the caster can finish before the target breaks free. Aster answers that panic by showing up with the kind of weapon that makes people stop talking. He tells them to look closely, then drives home that the spear is not decoration, but a promise of brutal reach, the sort of thing that ends a fight before the other side understands the terms. Back in the ruined alley, the enemy tries to save the situation with another surge of magic, but Aster keeps the pressure on and refuses to give ground. The clash turns into a test of who can hold their body together longer, and the answer starts looking ugly when blood comes into it. Then the real turn lands. The opponent is no longer just fighting, he is changing, and that means Aster is dealing with something more dangerous than a normal mage. The transformation proves the battle has crossed into something deeper, where identity itself becomes part of the weapon. Aster is still paying for the last exchange when the enemy's damage finally shows on his face. That matters because this fight is no longer about flashy magic. It is about whether either of them can keep their body and identity intact long enough to matter. Back in the alley, Aster uses the opening to press the smaller figure for something important, and the other side reacts like he has just seen the floor fall out from under him. The question hanging over this moment is simple. Aster has found a weak point, so what exactly is he dragging out of this enemy? The fight snaps back into motion as the enemy gathers magic and tries to regain control, but Aster answers with speed and pressure instead of backing off. He is chasing an answer through the chaos now, because if he lets this target recover, the trail to the people behind him goes cold. That chase only gets uglier when the corruption deepens, and the magical signatures start mutating into something harder to read. Aster is no longer dealing with a normal spell duel. He is staring at the kind of power that hides people, twists them, and makes them harder to kill than they should be. Then the enemy's confidence turns into open triumph, which tells Aster this whole mess has been planned far beyond one alley fight. The corrupted zone is now producing a real breakthrough, and whatever is being summoned here looks like a weapon built to outgrow ordinary restraint. Nice to know subtlety never made it to the meeting. The target's prize becomes clear next. A crystal, a command gesture, and a threat aimed straight at Professor Perun, the academic who knows too much and matters enough to be hunted. That threat lands harder because it names the route forward for Aster, since reaching Professor Perun now means cutting through the protection around Genian Academy first. From there, the scene pivots again into a stranger, more unstable phase, as power and distortion swallow the body in front of him. Aster is seeing the real cost of this hidden war now. People are not just fighting for victory, they are reshaping themselves into tools, and he has to decide whether he can use that weakness or survive it. Aster and the Academy fighters are still in the middle of a magical bloodletting, and the first thing that matters is that someone here thinks confidence can substitute for control. The smug gestures and raised staff only tell the truth faster. This is a power test, and everyone in the room is trying to prove they are not the one who breaks first. That swagger gets answered hard when the exchange turns into a real contest of force instead of posturing. One side throws everything it has, the other side eats the hit, redirects it, and keeps standing, which means this fight is already less about winning cleanly, and more about who can survive the next few seconds with their pride intact. Then the scene mutates into something nastier, because new combatants enter with their own power already awakened. Their advance forces Aster into pure defense, and the room starts reading him as the problem, not the victim, which is exactly how a bad day becomes a massacre. Even the labels like 101 make it feel like these people are being treated like inventory, which is a cheerful little detail if you enjoy dehumanization with your lunch. Aster catches the worst of it and nearly loses himself in the pressure, because this fight is now threatening the one thing he actually came here with, his future. When he cries out, it is not just pain, it is the panic of a man watching his power, his plan, and his sense of control all get stomped at once. Back in the same fight, the people facing him finally realize he is moving faster than they can comfortably process, and that changes the shape of the whole exchange. One of them starts laughing like the rules stopped applying, which usually means either a breakthrough or a funeral is coming, and neither option is generous. That pressure cracks the scene open into the Academy side of things, where technique matters just as much as raw output. Aster is still watching the board shift, but now the important question is who is actually being gathered here, and what kind of faction game is sitting underneath all this bracelet business. Now the argument stops being abstract and turns into plain suspicion. Somebody is trying to collect everyone's bracelets, and that means the group is being sorted, tracked, or hunted for a reason. The answer lands uglier than the question, because the bracelets are not a status symbol here. They are evidence of who got discarded and who got left holding the scraps. That explanation makes the room snap into a sharper kind of fear, because it connects the people speaking now to the wider mess around them. The shock on their faces says the same thing Aster is starting to learn the hard way. In this world, your allies, your rivals, and your leftovers can all be part of the same trap, and somebody is already smiling like they know exactly how it ends. Aster is still in the middle of a situation that keeps getting bigger than anyone in the room wanted. A massive presence drops into view and the whole crowd recoils, which tells him this Academy business is not just a test of talent, it is a sorting machine for people who can survive the next ugly thing. Then the conversation turns personal. A white-haired boy answers that he has a friend, and he doubles down on that trust like it is the only thing keeping him upright, while the brown-haired observer realizes this answer does not fit the boy he thought he knew. A masked figure cuts in and greets Friesen like an old enemy, not a stranger, which means the room is already full of history before anyone throws a spell. Friesen immediately tries to look dangerous by bragging that he once went into the demonic realm to kill him, because apparently subtlety never made it past the front gate. Back with Aster, the gathered group is now framed around active magic instead of rumor, so the real danger finally has a shape. That matters because this is the point where the scene stops being about who knows whom and becomes about who can still move when the killing starts. Hound arrives and the mood turns rotten fast. The woman tries to stop him, but Hound makes it clear he is not here by choice. He is here because a contract has already tied his hands, and that is exactly the kind of excuse that usually comes with a corpse at the end of it. Hound follows that up by drawing his massive curved blade and revealing the Weimar family's wind magic, which explains why everybody gets nervous the moment his name shows up. The Weimar house is known for speed and piercing power, so this is not just a thug with a big weapon. This is a trained killer with noble backing and no patience left. Now Aster gets dragged into the real reason the room is spiraling. People are arguing over what he knows, what he did, and whether he is already dead inside their plans. He snaps back at the repetition because the conversation is circling the same fear over and over, and he wants the fight to start honestly instead of as a coward's interrogation. That short fuse finally becomes a battle. Aster drives his power straight downward and answers Hound with overwhelming force, while Hound keeps trying to survive the exchange with barriers, summoned weapons, and movement, which means the contract-bound killer is still dangerous even under pressure. The fight makes the faction split impossible to ignore. Hound is no ordinary enforcer, and Aster is no longer just a masked troublemaker getting chased through Academy politics, because both sides are now committing real power to the question of who gets to leave this room alive. Hound, the Weimar family's contracted killer, keeps trying to turn the fight into a simple hunt, but Aster answers him with the anger of a man who already died once and refuses to stay down. When Hound's pressure starts closing off every normal escape, Aster stops playing evasive and commits to the hit, because surviving this exchange means proving he can break a professional killer instead of just enduring him. The strike finally turns ugly for Hound. Aster gets his hands on the chains, tears through the restraint, and shatters the weapon that was supposed to keep him pinned, which means the hunter loses the clean advantage and has to admit Aster can muscle through even a loaded setup. The room stops being about control and becomes about who breaks first, and Hound clearly hates that answer. Back on Hound's side of the fight, he tries to recover by barking orders and dressing the whole thing up like discipline. But that only exposes the real hierarchy problem here. He expects Fear to do the work for him. Aster does not give him that luxury, and when the exchange shifts again, it is no longer a chase but a direct test of whether Hound can keep pretending he is the bigger predator. Aster answers the taunting with a burst of power that flips the fight on its head, and Hound pays for underestimating the brat he keeps insulting. The hit leaves him screaming about his arm and calling for space like a man who suddenly remembers consequences, because now he has lost the neat little advantage that made him cocky in the first place. That collapse is what opens the door to something worse than a duel. Aster pushes into a demonic realm, braces himself, and waits for the next threat to come to him, because this fight is no longer just about beating Hound. It is about surviving whatever is standing behind him, and the answer arrives in the form of a demon whose whole attitude says this is only the beginning. The demon fully steps out of the dark realm and makes the whole fight feel like a trap that has finally closed. It does not waste time on theatrics either, because the point is simple. Aster's friends are now part of the threat, and the thing in front of him expects Fear to do the rest. Aster answers by refusing to fold when the demon comes at him, even as the pressure turns vicious enough to make him cry out in pain. That is the turn in the exchange. The demon wants to break his body and his nerve at the same time, but Aster stays in the fight long enough to land a brutal counter and stop the momentum from staying one-sided. Back in the middle of the clash, Aster realizes the strange purple artifact and the magic circuit around it are not just decorations, they are the key to forcing a bigger spell through. He commits to it anyway, which is the kind of decision that wins battles and wrecks hands if he gets it wrong. The spell blooms from a careful channel into something huge, and now Aster is not just defending himself, he is taking control of the entire exchange. That matters because once the magic starts spilling out in waves, the demon loses the luxury of bullying him up close. Then Aster releases the real answer to the ambush, a claw spell strong enough to tear through multiple enemies at once. The attack proves he is no longer scrambling just to survive, but it also leaves him wounded and spent, which is the price every big win keeps charging him. After the burst of violence, the story pulls back for a breath and shows how far this whole chase has spread, from the black-white zone to the kingdom's back alleys and even the Empire's underworld. In other words, Aster's life is no longer a local grudge match. It is moving through every rotten layer of the world that tried to bury him. That wider hunt keeps rolling as Aster is still being pursued and dragged from place to place, while other figures close in around the same magical pressure point. By the time the Vortex, the formal figure, and the wounded woman all appear in the same stretch, the message is blunt. Everyone wants a piece of this power, and nobody is here to be polite about it. At the end, someone leans in hard with the one thing that actually matters in a mess like this. Keep breathing, keep listening, and do not die yet. That turns the scene from raw combat into a grim pause before the next reveal, because Aster is being pushed to rest just long enough to hear the part that will matter next. Aster keeps replaying the same ugly truth in his head. Freedom is what he wanted, and it is exactly what got him hunted down. Now that he has a second life, his revenge stops being a grief-soaked promise to dead comrades, and turns into something colder, sharper, and a lot more useful. Back in the present, Aster's will finally catches up to his power, and the fight shifts in his favor. He stops reacting like prey and starts pressing forward, which is the whole point of coming back at all. That confidence lands hard because Aster knows exactly who he is fighting now and exactly why it matters. He grins through the chaos, treats this as the moment he waited for, then pulls out the forbidden artifact and makes the whole thing personal instead of merely violent. With his opponent flattened, Aster stands over the wreckage and stops pretending this is just one score to settle. He swears to recreate the pain his enemies caused, one by one, which tells you his revenge has gone from survival to methodical punishment. The scene then snaps wider, because Aster's dominance is drawing in bigger problems than a single victim can represent. In an alley full of cracked stone golems, the next layer of the story shows that this world's magic has moved past duels and into organized chaos. From there, the pressure spreads into a rescue and response scramble. Someone on a ladder screams for the students to be found, while two suited men push the situation harder, and a blonde fighter with magenta eyes decides the cleanest answer is to capture the intruders before they slip away. That plan immediately runs into the ugly cost of fighting over magical territory. People get broken, and the strong step in to control the fallout. Aster gets helped up by a woman while an older robed man watches, and nearby a giant golem-bound threat hangs over the students like a warning that nobody here gets to stay comfortable for long. Then the mystery tightens again around Professor Perun, the academic tied to local knowledge and whatever this incident is really about. When his name comes up, it is not a casual introduction, it is a sign that the people in this mess are starting to identify who matters and who needs to be watched. Back in the same confrontation, someone gets blasted back and spends the next moment just trying not to fold. The point is simple, the exchange is no longer about showing off, it is about who can take a hit and still remain useful. A blonde man leans over the injured figure and demands an explanation, because even in a disaster, people still want names and reasons before they want results. That hesitation gives the scene a nasty little pause, the kind that says the next answer will matter more than the injury. Meanwhile, the confrontation conversation keeps spreading into new faces and new tensions, with Carrie stepping into view as the next name worth tracking. The moment shifts from raw force to recognition and positioning, which means everyone is now measuring who stands with whom before the real fight resumes. Aster then pushes into the wider magical system itself, watching the interface of power instead of just the people throwing it around. That is the larger game here. He is not only surviving attacks, he is learning the shape of the world that tried to kill him. At the end of the exchange, a white-haired caster throws another blue spell toward a distant target, and the conflict refuses to settle. The takeaway is blunt: nobody has earned peace yet, and every new spell only proves that the struggle around Aster is still widening. Aster has survived the first crash of violence, and now the fight shifts into something colder: spellcraft, rank, and the question of who actually controls this mess. He is no longer just trying to stay alive. He is learning how the world's magic works well enough to use it against the people hunting him. In the rain, the confrontation widens as figures descend toward the stone plaza, and the whole scene starts to feel less like a duel and more like an execution dressed up as a test. One caster hurls power with way too much confidence, which is usually a sign that somebody important is watching. Aster is still being measured, and the book in his hands matters because this is where hidden knowledge starts turning into leverage. The ancient tome and its sun face mark suggest the real fight is not just about force anymore. It is about who understands the system first. Then the rain scene turns into an authority check. Aster's confidence meets an elder who can pin him down with rank alone, and the apology that follows tells you everything. The Academy's hierarchy can be just as dangerous as any spell. Back in the presence of Aster's struggle, he is soaked, cornered, and forced to answer pressure with composure instead of panic. Professor Felina's advice gives him a foothold, and Aster answers the tension by standing back up and gathering power, which means he is choosing to keep fighting even when the room wants him broken. Rewind to the academy, back when the rain is still turning every lesson into a test. Aster stops playing defensive and starts answering pressure with real control, which is the first sign he is no longer just surviving the room. On the rooftop, Aster pushes the exchange far enough to force the other side to talk instead of posture. He asks for the next piece of the problem, because this fight is not really about winning a spell contest anymore. It is about digging up who has been moving pieces behind the scenes. The rain-soaked standoff turns ugly as Aster gets the upper hand and makes the other figure kneel. That matters because rank and fear are now doing half the work for him, and the person across from him has to decide whether to stay proud or start telling the truth. The other side tries to answer through ritual and posture instead of a clean explanation, but Aster keeps pressing until the mask slips. The whole thing boils down to a hierarchy lesson with teeth. Somebody here is trying to act above him, and Aster is not buying it. Aster then shuts the gap and forces a real breakthrough, the kind that comes with power surging back through a body that was supposed to stay ordinary. The scene shifts from talk to revelation, because once he can stand in that state, the next question becomes who he is really fighting and what debt the past still demands. Now the argument finally gets to the point. Aster demands the names of the people who caused this mess, and the answer lands on the Declan family, the noble house that ruined the Blando family, and carries the heavenly origin art. That is the real shape of the revenge story here, because Aster is no longer chasing random enemies. He is tracking the house at the center of the whole wound. The interrogation keeps going, and the topic shifts to a mage who ended up as wyvern food, which tells Aster he is circling a larger trail of deaths and cover-ups. When he calls out the lie in front of him, the reply swings the blame toward the Weimar family, and the other side's manic expression makes it clear this conversation is about to get a lot less stable. Back when Aster is still in the rain, the elder finally drops the attitude and asks the masked troublemaker to spell out how he knows so much. Aster does not waste the opening, because this whole exchange is really about whether the old man trusts him enough to stop hiding the truth. Aster stands there thinking it through instead of rushing the answer, and that pause matters, because he is weighing how much of the past he can expose without blowing up the room. When he speaks again, the force in his answer starts to shake loose something bigger than simple gossip. Aster cuts off a bad assumption, and the younger person in front of him takes it like a punch to the chest. The rain keeps falling, but the real damage is the realization that this trail is tied to people and deaths he cannot shrug off anymore. The next part of the talk turns practical. The request gets pushed to later, which means Aster is no longer dealing in vague promises, but in a plan with timing attached. That is why the artifact matters, because it is not just a relic. It is being treated as the thing that can help protect a tower even magic professors might not crack open. Nice little luxury item if your hobby is surviving impossible attacks. The problem is not the artifact itself, but the people around it, because convincing Professor Felina about Aster is still a chore even for the allies standing here. So they commit to moving ahead anyway, which tells you the tower project is no longer a dream on paper. It is becoming a real political headache. Now the scene shifts into social regrouping, and the mood loosens just enough for old connections to show through. People greet each other like they have history, joke about weight gain, and fold Aster into the circle as someone who clearly already changed the group once before. That warmth does not last long, because the conversation pivots straight back to status and suspicion. The woman on the couch judges Aster from above and makes it plain that anyone tied to Declan carries dirt with them, which is exactly the kind of social poison that can wreck a plan before the real fighting even starts. Back in the rain, the tension settles into something colder and more personal, with stoic silence on one side and an embrace in the dark on the other. That closes the loop on this flashback by showing what all this power talk is actually circling: loyalty, resentment, and the kind of bonds that survive abuse long enough to become revenge. Inside the academy, the mood finally shifts from suspicion to something closer to a tense truce. The woman in the purple dress decides Aster does not look like an immediate danger to the academy, which matters because his whole life keeps getting judged before it gets understood. Now the story broadens out and shows that nobody here is operating alone. Different players sit on different tracks, and Aster is still the one caught in the middle, trying to read a room full of people who all want something different from him. Back in the rain, the fighting comes back hard enough to remind him what this all costs. Aster stands his ground under magical pressure instead of folding, because survival is not enough anymore, and that stubbornness is exactly why the people around him keep circling him like he is a problem to solve. Somewhere quieter, the conversation turns serious enough that nobody can hide behind manners anymore. One person forces themselves to say the hard truth, and the others react like they have just realized the real threat is not the surface-level drama, but whatever has been buried underneath it. That truth lands fast. The gauntlet is not just a prize, it is bait for people dangerous enough to hunt it down. The two cloaked figures make the risk plain, and now Aster's problem is no longer just keeping his own head down, but surviving the moment stronger factions decide to move. Aster then recognizes the scale of the threat for what it is, comparing it to the kind of pressure House Declan brings when it really wants someone dead. The woman pushes him on what he is hiding, but he answers with that same slippery confidence, which tells you he is still keeping his cards tight even while the danger keeps getting bigger. And then the magic itself starts answering that tension. Aster pushes his power forward, the woman meets it without flinching, and the whole exchange says the same thing from both sides. This is no longer simple investigation. It is a test of who is willing to get involved in the mess. By the end, one of them agrees to look into it, which turns suspicion into motion. The final quiet at the window fits the moment because the danger is no longer hypothetical now, and everybody in this room knows it is coming whether they like it or not. Aster keeps moving while the academy tries to shove its students back to the dormitory, which tells him the adults are already corralling everyone before the next mess spills over. He is still outside the easy answers, still listening for the part nobody says out loud. Outside the carriage, Aster watches the exchange tighten into a warning he does not fully trust yet. When Carrie gets dragged into the conversation, and Aster asks not yet, he is really asking whether the bigger move has finally started, or whether everyone is still pretending this is normal. Then the scene stops being about school chatter and turns into noble family business, because the man at the center is being treated like a problem that needs to be beaten into shape. The family head gets called out directly, and the answer comes fast and ugly enough to show this is already a blood feud with manners scratched off. Aster is forced to read the men around that confrontation like pieces on a board. One authoritative figure, one calm dark-haired man, and another who carries power like it is already his birthright. The point is not the spell work itself, it is that the people at the top are deciding who gets protected and who gets sacrificed. Back in the same power struggle, the Weimar Patriarch steps forward as the kind of ruler who does not just crush enemies, he erases families. His own words make the threat plain. He does not stop at killing a man, he cuts through the whole bloodline and calls that strategy. With the Patriarch's death confirmed, the story widens into the rotten logic underneath all these noble houses. Someone remembers being offered a hand by a man who murdered his own relatives for Declan, which means Aster is looking at a world where loyalty is measured by how many people you are willing to bury for the right name. And yes, they even stamped the name into the records with mystical numerals, because subtlety clearly missed the briefing. Now the recap snaps into the second life behind Aster's revenge. He is shown isolated, working alone in a barren place, then drawing power into his own hand, which makes his growth feel less like a gift and more like the price of surviving long enough to matter. That growth is not just personal though, because the montage of faces and the final display of severed heads make the noble conflict look organized, inherited, and vicious. By the time the narrative points back to entering the academy as an undergraduate, Aster's path is no longer a simple comeback story. It is a climb into the same machine that eats houses and calls it order. Back in the academy politics lane, Aster is surrounded by the usual proof that status matters here. The students who win get to celebrate, the ones who lose get shoved around, and the whole place runs on who can bully whom without getting punished. That is the real lesson on display before the ceremony even starts, because this school rewards power first and calls it education after. At the awards ceremony, the academy shifts from street-level scuffles to public recognition, which matters because this is where reputation gets assigned in front of everyone. Yvelin de Planche, the Goldrun's daughter, is introduced beside Callahan, and Aster notes that she does not look like the standout he somehow remembers from his past life. So the scene is doing two jobs at once, handing out honors and quietly reopening old memories that may not match the present. The official then hands out a reward box to Callahan in front of the crowd, and the academy makes a point of dressing up a simple object like it is a state secret. Aster receives his own box next, which tells him he is no longer just a survivor hanging around the edges. He is now important enough to be publicly compensated for what he has done. Nice little wooden box, very normal, very not suspicious at all. Once the ceremony ends, the story pivots hard, because new power always attracts new trouble. The magical display erupts into citywide chaos, and that burst of attention pushes everyone out of ceremony mode, and back into a world where the tower, money, and ambition all start colliding at once. Now the thread moves to a tower corridor, and the people tied to Aster's next move, because this is where the bigger plan starts demanding meetings instead of applause. A cloaked figure heads toward the usual meeting place. A white owl cuts into the space like a warning sign with feathers, and Aster is pulled toward whatever information exchange is waiting on the other side. Then he takes off over the city, which means the tower game is no longer abstract. It is happening right now, and he has to keep moving if he wants to stay ahead of Declan and everyone else circling his second life. Aster, still pushing his second life forward instead of getting swallowed by it, races across open ground toward Professor Perun's place. The mansion ahead matters because this is where information turns into opportunities, and Aster cannot afford to miss either. At the door, Aster shows up and makes his presence known, but the talk immediately shifts to the problem he has been thinking through on the move. Meeting in one place leaves them exposed. Professor Perun, an academic who knows the local web of factions, answers that he already considered the risk and worked around it. Little details like this are how people stay alive when House Declan keeps hunting. Aster asks where he is supposed to go next, and Professor Perun says he checked with old colleagues and managed to dig up a lead, though his sentence breaks off before the full answer lands. That hesitation tells Aster this is not a simple errand. It is a carefully arranged favor with consequences attached. Then the professor hands over a sealed document covered in magical marks, and the whole conversation changes shape. Aster starts pressing for what the missing apology was about, because he can tell something is being kept from him, and the answer is already buried in the paperwork he just received. Aster studies the document and feels the tension ease for a moment, because the papers mean he has real backing instead of another empty promise. Professor Perun lays out the reward too. 3 top-grade elixirs, including the one tied to the Distanis Award ceremony, which means Aster's next move is not just about survival anymore, it is about stocked power and official recognition. Back in the formal meeting room, the adults around him are already thinking several steps ahead. One of them says she originally planned to bring the man to the academy, but now the priority is different, so she tells someone else to help him wrap up his loose ends instead. Aster gets a rare moment of near relief in the middle of all that pressure, and the name Rai floats in like a small mystery that does not get explained yet. Outside in the plaza now, the story shifts from favors and paperwork into Aether training, because Aster cannot cash in on any of those rewards unless he keeps getting stronger. The old knight-style body reinforcement technique is the starting point here, and it matters because it gives him a practical path to survive the people closing in on him. That means the next exchange is not decoration, it is the groundwork for his power jump. Aster finally meets resistance in direct combat, and the point is simple. If he loses here, all the talk about towers and revenge stays a dream. He clashes with an opponent under Aether pressure, then starts pushing a technique through his wrist and arm, which shows he is no longer just reacting to danger, he is learning how to weaponize it. The grin afterwards says the same ugly truth every strong fighter eventually learns, which is that progress usually looks a little unhinged up close. Back in the ruins, Aster settles into a steadier phase of growth, crossing his legs and gathering power instead of burning it all in one burst. The technique keeps advancing, and the cyanide close-up and the surge that follows show that his Aether is beginning to move the way he wants, not the way his enemies expect. That is the difference between surviving a fight and actually building a future. Then the firebrand takes over, and this is where Aster's power stops looking theoretical and starts looking dangerous. The rune patterns, the red-hot flood of force, and the malicious grin all point to the same thing. He has found a technique that can become a real threat, not just a training node in a professor's file. Now the only question left is how much stronger it can make him before it burns him back. Aster comes out of the last exchange still standing, and that matters because this is the moment he stops looking like a survivor and starts looking like someone who can actually shape his next move. He has tested the new force inside him, found a way to make it answer, and now he needs to decide what to use it on before it cooks him from the inside. Now back on the rooftop, Aster starts thinking like a mage instead of a brawler. He wonders whether mixing healing light into the technique will stabilize it, or just make the whole thing explode in a more educational way. Meanwhile, in a calmer indoor conversation, the broader school world starts closing in on him. The talk turns to academy midterm evaluations, which means Aster is no longer just training for revenge. He is being pulled into the system that will judge whether he belongs there at all. That pressure lands on Damien, a student already being grilled about whether he has kept up with the professor's assignments, because this academy clearly rewards the prepared and punishes everyone else. Aster is about to step into that same world, so the next lesson is not abstract anymore. It is a warning about how much paperwork and power stand between him and his goal. Then the conversation snaps back to Aster, and somebody finally asks him directly what he wants. He does not waste time pretending to be noble about it either, because he asks to use Dahlia for the exams, promising to return her afterward, which sounds suspicious enough to make everyone in the room stop breathing for a second. That answer pushes the situation from negotiation into open conflict, and Aster immediately tests how far he can force the issue. Dahlia pushes back by insisting on her own free will, so Aster answers with the kind of sarcasm that says he is either in control or deeply committed to looking like he is. Aster cuts the tension off before anyone can drag the talk out any further. He says he is short on time because exams are coming, which is his way of reminding everyone that his real fight is not just in this room but in the school system closing in on him too. He then pins down the actual lesson. He wants interpersonal combat training, not some vague lecture about theory. That matters because Aster is not here to be polite or academic. He is here to learn how to survive a fight with people who know know how to corner and punish him. The room goes quiet, and Callahan, Declan's red-haired mage enforcer who handles the house's hard business, is the one steering the conversation now. The talk has shifted from pure posturing to practical control, with complaints, accusations, and one very ugly question hanging over the table. Who gets to decide what kind of power is allowed? That pressure lands on the next person in line, and brown-haired instructor is suddenly told to teach Dahlia. He is shocked because this is not a small request, it is a reminder that the training system is already picking winners and assigning roles before the lesson even starts. In the training space, Dahlia makes the demands simple. She does not want a fancy speech, she wants the moves Aster used against Aster. The point is obvious even if nobody says it out loud, because she is not asking to admire his style. She is asking to steal the part that actually works. Brown-haired instructor shuts that down fast and replaces her idea with a real combat lesson. He says the first person to bash the other guy's head in wins, which strips away the fantasy and turns the whole thing into a blunt lesson about pressure, timing, and finishing before the other side can think. Years earlier, the lesson gets its nightmare proof. A mage unleashes overwhelming power while everyone watches, and the aftermath shows a city reduced to burning ruin. This is not just spectacle. It explains why Aster's world treats combat as a matter of who dominates first and who gets erased. Back in the wider occult memory of that conflict, another figure answers with cold certainty instead of panic. Standing in a strange power-lit state over a vast water surface, he makes it clear that someone named Evelyn already has enough, which sounds less like mercy and more like a verdict that cannot be argued with. The scene shifts again, and this time the danger hides behind customer service. A smiling server greets the table, serves tea, and starts talking about a secret hideout, using the calmest voice in the room to make the setup feel even more suspicious. That calm quickly breaks when the customer realizes what is being implied and starts to panic. The server keeps the pressure on by bringing up the magic department, then asks the sharpest possible follow-up about whether they are meant to go together, which turns a simple order into a quiet trap of intent and association. Callahan, Declan's Red Jewel vice leader, and one of the people who can turn a room cold without raising his voice, watches the server's signal through the window and answers with a quiet, almost pleasant agreement. That kind of calm matters here, because it means the pressure is already working, and nobody in the room gets to pretend this is a friendly exchange anymore. The conversation slips into a gate, a hood, and a formal hall, which tells you the real meeting is no longer public, even if the questions still are. When Aster hears whatever is coming and Blurt denies it, the situation hardens fast. Someone has cornered him, and the only thing left is whether he can keep his story straight. Aster gets hit with the direct version of the trap, because the masked figure drops the polite act and demands answers about what he was discussing with that person. Aster immediately starts stumbling, and that hesitation gives the game away before he even finishes speaking. Then Aster's magic flares and the exchange stops being verbal, which means the masked figure has decided words are no longer enough. The attack forces Aster to survive the accusation in the most literal way possible, and the whole point is simple. One wrong move here, and he is exposed. Instead of letting Aster breathe, the masked figure orders him to walk with him to the warehouse, as if this interrogation is just another errand. Aster pushes back, but the answer is another threat, because the masked figure wants to control where the conversation happens and who gets to hear it. Back in the aftermath of the exam, the tension changes shape instead of going away. Aster's name lands like a shock, and the students around him start obsessing over scores because in this world a perfect result is not just bragging rights, it is proof that somebody is either brilliant or up to something. The story then cuts to a shadowed figure moving alone, which keeps the pressure alive even while the room changes. That shift matters because the results are not just being celebrated or questioned, they are already feeding into a wider network of people watching, judging, and planning around Aster. Aster hears the gossip and needles it back with a casual line about someone badmouthing him, which is basically his way of saying he knows the room is talking behind his back. It is a small flex, but it also shows he understands the real game now. Reputation is another weapon, and he is not letting other people swing it first. Elsewhere indoors, a towering figure looms over a younger student, while Aster starts cranking up spell work, first in a controlled form and then at full size. That escalation tells you he is not just reacting anymore. He is building enough force to make people take him seriously, which is the only way revenge and survival can coexist. Now the focus turns to what the spell actually means, because somebody is already tracing it back to its origin, instead of just admiring the damage it can do. At the same time, a hooded messenger brings papers to a red-haired girl and says the material is definitely from the academy, which turns the whole thing into a paper trail with teeth. That report moves into approval and credit, with the promise that Devil will be recognized once everything is reviewed and the family is contacted again. The woman's contempt makes the real mood obvious. Nobody in this circle trusts anyone. They just keep score while smiling through their teeth. Outside that paperwork and suspicion, Aster and Callahan cross paths again, and Aster immediately tries to turn the pressure into a social trap of his own by inviting her to dine together. He then writes her off as rotten to the core, which tells you he is not here to charm her so much as test how far her mask will stretch before it cracks. Aster, the black-clad mage who survives by reading danger faster than other people read letters, realizes the crystal ball record in his hand is only the start of the problem. He catches something off in the evidence, snaps to attention, and immediately shifts from collecting proof to defending his own neck. Because once a house starts making paper trails, it usually means the real fight is happening off to the side. Inside the cathedral, Aster pushes through the aftermath with the same stubborn focus that got him killed the first time, and the scene turns from raw survival to official scrutiny. The question is no longer whether he acted, but how the institution will package what he did, and that kind of approval is always just a prettier leash. Callahan, Declan's red-haired vice leader who never looks relaxed for long, starts piecing together that Demon is tied to something bigger than a simple exam result. Her hesitation says the quiet part out loud. This school business is already tangled with faction politics, and somebody is about to get dragged into the middle of it. That suspicion turns into a formal summons, and the corridor conversation makes it clear Demon is being pulled away for a reason no one wants to say out loud yet. Callahan is left in the worst possible spot, hearing only enough to know the situation has gone from awkward to serious, which is usually how trouble introduces itself before it starts billing people. Elsewhere in the school, the students catch wind of a sudden assembly, so the whole place shifts from routine to rumor in about one breath. Callahan stays composed on the outside, but the reaction around her makes it obvious that whatever is coming has already started rattling the crowd. Now in the ornate hall, Callahan stands under the weight of a public announcement, and the mood changes from gossip to ceremony. The speaker starts praising a student's courage, which means the school is not just judging merit here, it is deciding who gets lifted up in front of everyone, and who gets exposed. Aster watches the whole thing with the calm of a man who understands how useful public praise can be when you know what it hides. He calls it a fine sight. Callahan quietly looks away, and the title of righteous troubleshooter lands like a badge that sounds clean until you remember every institution loves a useful hero, right up until he stops being useful. Back in the school's ranking area, the posted results finally surface, and that shifts the whole conversation from ceremony to consequence. Aster and the others react because rankings do not just measure talent here. They decide who gets noticed, who gets targeted, and who gets pushed toward the next fight before they are ready. Aster has already taken one step into the bigger game, and now the paperwork proves it. Around him, rank is turning into power, and power is turning into targets. In this academy, a number on a sheet can open doors or put a knife in your back, so the next few announcements matter a lot more than the crowd wants to admit. Damien von Blando, the Blando family's young master, lands at 18th, and the room reacts like someone just kicked the floor out from under them. Then the ranking sheet keeps digging because Deminin is still sitting above him, which tells everyone Damien is climbing, but he is not anywhere near the top yet. Damien tries to cash in on the progress he has earned, but the talk around him shifts to the multiplication formula he had to grind through to get here. That is the real trade in this school: sweat, theory, and humiliation first, reward later if the faculty feels generous. Somebody steps in to shut the noise down, and that keeps the room from turning into a full riot over one student's rank. The exchange that follows makes the power structure plain again. People in the system hand out documents, other people nod and swallow their complaints, because that is how the game stays orderly on the surface. Callahan, Declan's vice leader and the red jewel of the Mage Corps, gets the kind of praise that sounds simple only if you ignore what it costs to be effective. The comment that Damien has found a true companion tells us the important part. His side is forming around him, and that changes how dangerous he can become. The academy settles into the ugly truth that the midterm exams were chaotic, but the results leave most people satisfied enough to keep moving. Then the mood swings back toward knowledge and rank, because Carrie, the student tied to the dark red runic book, is already digging into magic like he plans to win by understanding the rules better than everyone else. With that settled, the authority in charge loosens the leash. Training sessions continue, but they are no longer mandatory, and students are free to chase their own path instead. That opens the door for private family training too, which means the houses now get a bigger say in who improves and who gets left behind. At the next appointment, Aster shows up to a warehouse that has clearly been repurposed into part of his plan, and he is already thinking like a builder instead of just a survivor. He says he leaves for a few days and everything looks different, which is a neat way of admitting he has not been standing still while everyone else is busy counting ranks. Inside the warehouse, Aster tests the place with magic and gets the result he wanted. The setup works, that matters, because this is how his second life turns from revenge into infrastructure. One successful experiment at a time, with enough space to start building something larger than a brawl. Back in the present inside the warehouse, Aster pushes the magic further and starts seeing how far he can take it. The response from the other side makes the conflict immediate again, because once someone asks what he is cooking up, it means his little project has stopped being private. Aster and the people around him react as the magic settles into something useful, and the mood turns from testing to confidence. That shift matters more than the sparkle of it all, because now he is not just guessing whether his power will hold up, he is starting to trust it. Back in the past, Aster is still in the middle of a brutal magic test, and the whole point is simple: if he slips for even a second, the spell crushes him. He keeps moving under the falling force, then pushes his own mana past the limit until the exchange stops being a test and turns into a straight-up duel over who can survive the blast. When the smoke clears, Aster lands hard, and the fight pauses just long enough for the real question to surface. His opponent stops caring about the spell and asks where he really comes from, because whatever Aster just did does not look like ordinary talent from the slums. The answer comes with a grin. Aster says he is from right here, and that is the whole point of him. He does not belong to some clean, noble origin story. He belongs to the place that made him dangerous, and that confidence is exactly why people keep underestimating him. That confidence gets tested again when the discussion turns to Deathros, a naturally occurring undead creature that moves by the soul. Aster identifies it by name, and the moment matters because this is no longer theory or rumor. It is a living problem with teeth that everyone in the room now has to account for. The situation gets uglier because the people around him do not have the resources to move fast enough, which means hesitation could get them killed. So the decision lands on Aster. Either he accepts help and waits, or he takes the burden and forces a solution himself. Aster makes the choice the hard way. He takes the artifact he is handed, realizes it is something important, and gets pulled close in a quiet moment that says more than the dialogue does. Someone is giving him power because they trust him to use it, not because they expect this to be cheap. Back in the present, Aster cuts off the dependence entirely and says he will handle it himself. That resolve turns into action when he tears through the papers in front of him, refusing to be managed by anyone else and proving he is done waiting for permission to move. Then the next force in the room arrives, a powerful man with red magic, the kind of arrival that makes private plans feel very small. Aster's problem is no longer whether he can act alone, but whether he can keep his footing once bigger players decide to get involved. Aster's problem is no longer private pride, because the room around him keeps filling with people who want answers, favors, or his head. The first figure draws his attention, and the panic in the exchange makes it clear somebody here is already one step from being hunted down. Now the scope widens, the woman drags the 4th base camp and Greentown into the conversation, which means this is not just one fight, but a moving search with real locations at stake. The man immediately faces the ugly part of the job, because finding a pathfinder is one thing, and forcing one to guide you through a dangerous route is another. Then the story snaps to the practical side of the hunt, where the map, the symbols, and the formal posture all say the same thing. Somebody is trying to turn chaos into a plan. Aster's side of this world keeps building itself through preparation, but the setup also makes the next interruption worse, because every careful arrangement looks stupid the moment magic starts moving. Back in the same exchange, the questions get personal fast, and the hooded figure confirms the name Leheim as if that explains everything. The casual greeting of senior lands like a joke with a knife hidden in it, while the other man admits the truth nobody likes saying out loud. He is here because he does not have the courage to bet his own life. That hesitation dies the second the warning hits, because someone decides there will be no second chances. The attack comes down hard, the target reels, and the whole exchange turns into a simple fact. This is not a negotiation anymore. It is an execution attempt. The pressure spikes again when the victim is caught flat-footed, and the attacker keeps escalating, demanding an answer while the spell keeps chewing through the room. Then the timeline itself feels like it jerks forward, because the countdown and the explosive hit make it obvious this fight is now running on borrowed seconds. As the dust settles, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes slips into the mess, and that changes the meaning of the whole scene. What looked like one isolated clash is now part of a bigger magical operation, with lightning, panic, and a familiar face all pointing to a wider conflict closing in on the target. Now the scene shifts into the new target phase, and the nickname Maul makes it obvious this is a coordinated handoff, not random chaos. The arrival grumbles about the heat, but the real news is that the spell has already worked and the seal is starting to break, which means the hidden thing they came for is finally coming loose. That leaves the mage with one ugly choice: keep the unsealing spell going and trust someone else to deal with the enemy alone. In other words, the mission is splitting in two, and Aster's world keeps doing what it always does now, handing him power, danger, and one more fight at the exact same time. Solion snaps the mood into focus. This is a hunt, not a stroll through the woods. The man beside him answers with ugly confidence about the exact numbers, which tells you this group is already counting bodies before the real trouble starts. Back in the forest, Solion pushes toward the masked hunters, while a warning hangs in the air that it does not matter what kind of monster stands in the way. Then the scarred man appears, stitched up and damaged in a way that says this mission has already chewed through people before Aster ever showed up. Elsewhere in the same hunt, a hooded figure has already finished one enemy and is still calm enough to call the result a success. That matters because this trip is not one battle, but a coordinated cleanup, with every survivor buying time for the next move. The hooded figure then turns polite in the most threatening way possible and greets Mr. Pathfinder like they are old business partners. Pathfinder shuts him down, but the exchange makes one thing clear: the group needs route finding more than muscle, and he is not handing it over for free. In the rainy sky, magic tears across the scene as the hunt scale jumps from small pursuit to full combat pressure. The hooded figure stays on task anyway, asks the mage for subspace, and gets the practical answer that the load has to keep moving, because this expedition cannot afford to stop carrying its own supplies. Then the chase explodes into motion through the forest, and Deathros, the undead threat at the center of this mess, reacts like even he did not expect this turn. A bearded man studies the paperwork behind the chaos, while the hooded figure hangs over his shoulder, which tells you this hunt is being run with cold logistics, not blind panic. That calm does not last, because goblins spring the trap and drag men down from behind, turning the hunt into an ambush cleanup. The bearded man identifies them as Kenti goblins from the second base camp area, and the hooded figure immediately reads the situation the way a veteran does. If they are here, then something worse has pulled the strings. The goblins are not random prey anymore either, since they sit high enough on this road's food chain to threaten anyone careless enough to split up. A man stands amid the bodies with a goblin at his feet, and the bearded companion still smiles through it, because at this point confidence is less a feeling and more a survival habit. With the danger rising, the hooded figure and his companion make the only sensible choice left, accept the risk and keep moving. He backs Rayleigh's pathfinding, trusting the route finder to keep them alive, which turns this from a brawl into a controlled push toward the next objective. The march does not get easier. Fire spells and swamp crossing plans make it obvious that every step toward the first base camp costs stamina, patience, and probably a few nerves, and the warning that a monster is bound to creep soon hangs over the group like bad weather that forgot to leave. Then the blame game starts, because someone admits they should have tracked down Deathros and eliminated it before things got this out of hand. The Rain of Fire answers that regret with force, and the team braces around Kari as the hunt's pressure finally starts looking like a larger war instead of a simple sweep. From there, the story widens into memory and rumor. 5 key figures are drawn together in a flashback-like beat, then the dark thing tied to the depths finally comes into view. That is the real hook of the expedition now, because nobody around this campfire knows the truth yet, and the hunt is about to prove how expensive that ignorance can be. Deathrow showing up in the wetlands is bad enough on its own, but the bigger problem is what it does to everyone else. The hunt stops being a tidy sweep and turns into a moving disaster. The team is already straining under the weight of that mistake, so the only way forward is to stop reacting and start planning. Back in the expedition briefing, the hooded leader lays out the ugly answer. They skip the first and second base camps and push straight to the third, because wasting time in the middle is how people get eaten. The others hesitate, but the plan is clear enough for even the loudest skeptic to swallow, which means the hunt just got a lot more serious. No one is here for a scenic walk through the mud. That is when the real target gets named. The creature is an ancient species, and once that misunderstanding gets corrected, the whole mood changes, because they are not just moving through the wetlands anymore. They are actively hunting something that can turn a whole expedition into scrap in one bad moment. With the stakes finally out in the open, one subordinate tries to take the blame off the leader, but the leader answers by readying magic instead of excuses. Aster cuts through the hesitation with a simple rule he lives by. When something needs doing, you do it, and you do not spend all day arguing with the problem like it is going to feel guilty. Aster makes the call final by firelight, then offers his help directly, which tells everyone he is not standing on the edge of this fight anymore. The unhooded figure's reaction matters because it confirms this is now a working alliance, not just a tense meeting, and Aster is already proving he can be useful where it counts. While they talk, the story widens into the next phase of the hunt. Carrie appears in the forest as a guide with real control over the situation, and even the morning chatter is about work, speed, and not getting turned into wyvern food before breakfast. That matters because this is no longer just a chase through rough ground. It is becoming a coordinated route through hostile territory. Once the route is set, the disciple commits to the task and Kari answers with force, testing whether the newcomer can actually follow instructions under pressure. The exchange stops being about confidence and becomes a practical trial, because in a hunt like this, obedience is the difference between reaching the target and becoming part of the landscape. Underwater in the marsh, Aster's power starts spreading past the point where normal people would stop and call a healer, because this fight is no longer about surviving a hit or two. Carrie's push has forced him into the kind of answer that either wins fast or leaves him cooked in the mud. In the same battle, a masked figure with cyan eyes steps in like he owns the place and orders the others to come greet their guests, which tells Aster this attack has already turned into a trap. The enemies are still confident enough to mock him, but that confidence gets shaky the moment the water starts raging back at them. Then the pressure flips hard. The masked entity bears down on Aster in the rain, but Aster snaps on overclock and forces his power past its normal ceiling, the kind of burst that saves your life and burns the clock down at the same time. That spike is enough to rattle everyone watching. Once the masked thing actually takes the hit and the crowd starts blurting out that he is a mage, the whole fight changes from a simple ambush into proof that Aster has stepped into a rarer, nastier tier of magic than the enemies expected. Aster then explains the ugly part of overclock himself. It cracks open dormant potential, but only for 5 minutes. That is the catch, and it matters because every second he spends talking about it is a second closer to the ability running out and leaving him stranded in front of something stronger than he is. Back in the fight, Aster stops thinking like a survivor and starts acting like an executioner. He gathers everything into one devastating flame technique, Mindscape Crimson Flame Phase 2, and lets it loose before the enemy can settle back into control. The blast tears the battlefield open and exposes what they are really up against. Not just a beast, but a fully manifested demonic entity lurking inside the inferno. Aster can still react, but now the problem is bigger than raw damage, because this thing has the shape and presence of something that expects the swamp to obey it. The creature's roar is not just noise, it is a weapon that scrambles the mana around it, so Aster has to read the trick instead of just hitting harder. He warns his ally not to stare into its eye too long, then locks onto the truth of the fight. This is the ruler of the swamp, disguised in a way that lets weaker creatures flee while it stays in control. Aster finally sees through the Swamp King's trick, and that changes the fight from blind panic into a real kill plan. He stops worrying about the smaller threats first and decides to clear the lesser monsters out of the way, because the big thing only stays dangerous while it has room to rule the field. Then Aster commits to the power he has been building, and the swamp answer him with the kind of pressure that means this thing is no ordinary beast. He powers up, comes in hard, and forces the creature to reveal just how much force it can still throw back, which is the only way the real winner gets decided. Aster answers the creature's counter with a finishing move, and that is the important part. He is not just surviving anymore, he is proving he can end a fight against something that thinks it owns the place. The strike lands as the turning point, because once the monster is broken, Aster's growth stops being a theory and becomes a fact. Back in the aftermath, Aster looks back on the earlier encounter and understands why that fight mattered so much. He realizes the difference between barely getting by and true strength. Then the story widens out into bigger players and stranger forces circling the same battlefield, which means his revenge is no longer just personal baggage, it is part of a much larger mess. That larger tension finally collapses back into camp, where Aster sits injured by the fire, while the air between him and the cloaked woman stays sharp and unfinished. She complains about the pain and the confusion, and Aster cuts in because he wants her attention on the real problem, not on the headache, which tells you this alliance is holding together by stubbornness more than comfort. Aster keeps the pressure on by asking the woman if she came looking for him, because he wants to know whether this meeting is a rescue, a setup, or both. He follows it immediately with a sharper question about where she has been, which tells you he is done with vague answers and wants the truth before he commits to anything. The woman pushes back with a simple why, and Aster finally shows his hand. He is after something worth selling, not just trouble for trouble's sake. That makes the whole exchange click into place, because this is not just an emotional reunion. It is two people testing whether the other can be useful without becoming a liability. Aster's companion is clearly nervous about the price of their leverage, since the Swamp Lord's carcass is supposed to be priceless and nobody sane throws that away lightly. But the woman answers like she expects discipline from him, then goes one better and praises him for caring more about other people than profit, which is her way of saying she trusts his judgment more than she trusts the market. Back in the campfire tension, Aster's face gives away the real problem. He is not playing the noble hero. He is still the same hard-eyed troublemaker who survived by making ugly decisions fast. His blue-eyed stare says the mercy and the violence are both still in him, which matters because everyone around him is trying to figure out which side they are standing next to. Aster, still running on stubbornness, asks what their plan is, because the next move matters more than the mood. The bearded man pushes back about whether they really need another day, and that complaint lands hard. After everything they have already suffered, more delay feels less like caution and more like punishment. The story then shifts into the next job, and the reason is simple. If they want real progress, they have to move from arguing in the dark to entering enemy territory. 3 hooded figures cross the snowy forest at night and finally reach the first base camp, which is the kind of place where people come for support and also get robbed if they blink. At the camp, the lack of lights immediately tells Aster he is not walking into a friendly welcome, just a place run by people who prefer control over comfort. When he starts answering questions about the camp's habits, he does it with the attitude of someone who already knows this place is tied up in extortion and ugliness, not goodwill. Nice to see the hospitality budget went straight into intimidation. Then the camp's real authority steps forward. Fiction, the chief who runs the first base camp, makes it clear this is not a random stop on the road, but a place with its own rules and teeth. He reaches out like he expects cooperation, and the awkward hand-swinging turns into a power test before anyone even says the real business out loud. Once the greetings settle, Fiction states the real issue and the mood tightens fast because he did not bring them here for small talk. He already knows enough about their scam plan to call it out, which means the camp chiefs are not isolated at all. They are watching each other and passing information around like this is a closed little empire of paranoia. That is when the standoff hardens. Fiction and the hooded figure face off, and the question stops being who is polite and becomes who controls the next move. Aster hears that the chiefs have a private communication network and realizes the situation is far worse than he thought, because this hunt is not just local trouble anymore, it is coordinated. The final exchange makes the split in the room obvious, with one side backing off and the other refusing to budge. That leaves Aster staring at a mess bigger than a single deal or a single camp, because now he knows the people around him are connected, informed, and already moving on a board he has only just started to see. Aster and the people around him are done pretending this is a small private problem. The tension in the room hardens into a real decision, because the next move can either buy him allies or get everyone dragged into House Declan's hunt. Then a cloaked intruder pushes into the tent and cuts straight through the calm, which tells Aster the camp is already being reached from the outside. The visitor doesn't come to chat, so the whole conversation snaps from negotiation to whatever emergency this is about to become. At the water's edge, one man tries to volunteer himself first, even though it is obvious he knows exactly what that costs. That is the ugly logic of this place. Somebody has to be fed to the danger, and everyone is trying to decide whose life counts as acceptable. Aster is pulled into that brutal bargain and answers with the same hard certainty as the others. He has stopped being a bystander in this camp business because now his name is in the middle of the hunt whether he likes it or not. Back in the fortified camp, the mood flips from argument to mobilization, and the leader finally cuts through the noise. He orders the force split in two, one half inside and one half outside, which means the camp is about to defend itself on both fronts, instead of waiting to be picked apart. Then the authority figure shuts down every protest and makes the real threat plain. Discipline has slipped, and anyone who keeps arguing is going to get beaten into obedience. The soldiers panic because this is no longer a warning. It is a forced reset before the next clash starts. Outside the fort, a mysterious figure closes in from the city side and watches the whole setup like he already knows how this ends. He moves fast, then breaks into a grin, which is never a comforting sign when everybody else is bracing for trouble. The masked leader is still trying to herd mercenaries into line, because the whole camp only works if the men stop freelancing and start obeying. One of them cracks nervous jokes about luggage and death, and another woman pushes even harder, asking to be taken in as a worker if they survive this mess, which tells you this crew is not acting heroic for free. Back with Aster, the dead serious part kicks in. Preparations are already done, which means somebody has been moving pieces before he even got the full story. When he demands to know who brought the persuaders here, the answer lands hard, because the target is not here anymore. He is at the second base camp now, so the hunt shifts locations instead of ending cleanly. A title card marks the shift, and this is the kind of turn that matters because the story stops being about one camp and starts pulling in a bigger back alley power play. Aster is no longer dealing with a single fight, he is being dragged into a wider scramble for control. Elsewhere in the frozen stretch outside, the chief, the camp leader who keeps order by force, stands his ground while the situation around him keeps getting uglier. The people under him are already twitching toward desertion, and that means his authority only holds if he can scare them back into shape before the next disaster hits. Chief Hong admits the ugly truth. He did not rise to power just to watch everything slip through his hands. He needles the hooded figure about joining the Aviot faction, then gets hit with the real warning that Destro is already mutating the Great Forest, which instantly turns this from petty politics into a survival problem. The pressure finally breaks into plain fear, because one side is staring at high-level threats while the other is counting deserters by the carriage load. The hooded figure admits he does not want to die, and that honesty is enough for Chief Hong to see exactly how weak the chain of command has become. So Chief Hong flips the whole power structure on its head and puts the hooded figure in charge. It is a blunt promotion, but it also exposes the real game here. In a camp this brittle, leadership goes to whoever can still stand when everyone else starts panicking. Aster has already turned this camp upside down, and now the only question left is who gets to hold the leash when everyone starts biting. The new chief tries to assert control, but the man across from him answers with the kind of threat that says this fight is not about pride anymore. It is about wiping the whole side off the board. Back in the clash itself, the old face behind the power finally shows its teeth, laughing like the idea of mercy never made it into the room. That blast of arrogance is exactly what the chief needs to answer, because if he folds here, the whole chain of command turns into scrap. The pressure cracks the battlefield open and throws the white-haired fighter into freefall, which means the fight is no longer just about holding ground. Aster drops in after him, and for once the masked mage is the one hunting the prey instead of the other way around. Aster does not waste the opening. He rises straight back into the fight, shrugs off the chaos, and forces the clash into his own terms, proving he is no longer the kid these people can simply chase into a corner. Then Aster looks at the battlefield and says what everyone else is too busy screaming to notice: there are rats everywhere. He is not talking about vermin for fun, he is calling out the way this whole place is crawling with hidden threats, and that makes the next order feel less like bravado and more like survival. That warning turns into a wider hunt, with fighters racing over the rooftops and throwing magic around the dead forest like they are trying to draw a line through the mess. The problem is bigger than one duel now, because the moment a monster and a hostile mage both enter the picture, nobody gets to pretend this is a clean power struggle anymore. The chief still keeps the upper hand by hitting first and harder, and that leaves the others scrambling around the wreckage of his decision. One woman even calls him out for overdoing it, which tells you the leadership fight has already started poisoning the people around it. As the dust settles, the scene widens again, and the faces of the mages matter more than the smoke. One figure reacts to a strange change with real confusion, while another stays cold and composed under pressure. And that contrast is the real story here. Some people are being rattled by the second life, and some are already preparing to use it. Aster stands over the burning settlement and makes the ugly point out loud. This kind of cruelty is not an accident. It is the message House Declan sends when it wants everyone scared and obedient. When the soldier asks whether Plen really had to be awakened in front of a massacre, Aster's answer is colder than the fire around them, because he wants Plen to see exactly what this war costs. Plen, the young man dragged into this nightmare, stops being a bystander and starts demanding the truth from Aster. He wants to know whether the slaughter is tied to the man in the black robe, and the hunt for Rays, which means the attack is bigger than one burned settlement and already pulling in a wider conflict. Back in the present, the battlefield widens again as the survivors and fighters scatter into separate problems, each one trying to keep up with events that are moving faster than they can think. That is the real pressure here. The fire is not just destroying a place, it is exposing how many different people now have a reason to move against Aster. Aster's side is no longer dealing with ordinary violence, because someone on the other end starts working forbidden magic instead of simple force. The name matters now too. Salvatium is not just some spell, it is the kind of power that turns a fight into a warning, and the laugh with the raven makes it clear the enemy enjoys the invitation to chaos. Still in the rain, Aster sizes up the prey in front of him and treats the fight like a hunt he has already accepted. He does not waste time pretending this is fair, because what matters is that he sees an opening, reaches for the weapon, and commits to finishing the problem before it grows teeth. Then the whole thing tips into full combat as Aster gets surrounded by hostile summons and refuses to fold under the pressure. He draws his weapon anyway, which proves he is past posturing and into survival mode, and the last blast says everything. If the enemy wants a spectacle, Aster is happy to answer with enough force to erase the room. Aster keeps pushing through a magical maelstrom because this fight is no longer about winning cleanly. If he gets swallowed here, House Declan's hunt ends him for good, so he forces his way through the blast instead of giving them the satisfaction. Even the room starts to feel like it is cracking under the strain, which is a bad sign when the people throwing the spells still look pleased with themselves. Then the real rule of the trap drops. Someone has built this whole mess around a judgment that only makes sense if death is part of the deal. The warning about the 13 sinners turns the battle into more than a brawl, because Aster is not just fighting a mage now. He is being dragged into a punishment system with its own cruel logic. He answers the pressure with a grin, which tells you he is still dangerous even while he is getting crushed in it. Aster answers the spell storm by forcing his own power back into the exchange, and that is the turn. He stops being the thing getting overwhelmed and becomes the thing that can break the setup, even if it costs him to do it. The important part is not the color of the magic, it is that he refuses to let the enemy control the terms of the fight. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a red mage keeps pressing forward while a blue-robed opponent realizes too late that the answer is not going his way. The counterspell reaches upward, but the strain lands back on the caster, which means the battlefield is starting to punish overconfidence. So the conflict shifts from raw force to control, and the side that can breathe still has a chance to decide what happens next. Then the masked Death Knight steps out like a nightmare that has learned how to aim, and that changes the whole scale of the fight. This is no ordinary summon, because the observer's reaction makes it clear the thing is terrifying even by this world's standards. Aster is not just surviving an attack anymore, he is standing in the middle of a summon that can wipe out anyone who gets careless. Back in the present under the rain, the summoner reins the violence in and makes the encounter personal. He lays out rules before the conversation can turn into another ambush, because he knows the only way to keep this from becoming a free-for-all is to control where the other person looks and how they move. Aster, soaked and glaring, does not trust a word of it, and his warning about the last sparing he gave tells you he has already learned how fast mercy gets punished. Aster pushes straight to the point and asks the question that matters. Did this person come alone, and why is he the target instead of the death row's business they are supposedly chasing? That is the real tension now, because if the answer points back to Aster, then this was never a random collision in the rain. The fight becomes a test of motives, and the smallest lie can turn the next second into an execution. The answer comes through in the aftermath, where both figures are still standing, but the mood has turned from raw violence to ugly negotiation. Whatever just happened has already cost them enough to force a pause, and Aster hates that almost as much as he hates the people trying to corner him. Then the red form appears again, which tells you the battle is not over, it is just shifting into a worse shape. Aster finally stops treating the thing in front of him like a problem and treats it like a person instead. He checks for the controller, frees the bound entity, and sends it off to rest, which is his way of saying he refuses to keep owning somebody else's suffering just because it would be convenient. That choice does not go cleanly, because the freed spirit does not want to vanish into some neat little ending. Aster is furious for half a second, then the spirit snaps the whole situation back into focus by choosing to stay on his own terms, and now Aster has to accept help instead of playing lone hero in the dirt. A stranger watching this thinks the whole thing is insane, and he is not wrong. The spirit answers with a kind of calm that makes bad news sound ancient, and Aster is left muttering at the sky because the knight has already turned this into a mess he did not ask for. Back in motion, Aster and the spirit head toward the prestigious house, which matters because this is no longer just a weird roadside encounter. Aster tries to be polite, the spirit corrects him like an old man offended by civilization, and that tells you the partnership is real now, whether Aster likes the tone or not. The recap then widens the frame and shows the larger battlefield around Aster's life, where names and titles matter because power gets remembered long after the fighting stops. The Kingslayer label, the masked fighters, and the other combatants all point to the same thing. Aster is moving into a world where reputation, alliances, and revenge are starting to fuse together. That wider struggle snaps back into the present when Aster makes a blunt offer to work together instead of cutting straight to bloodshed. The response around him is shock, because his enemies are used to attacks, not negotiations, and the next question is whether this uneasy deal turns into a real alliance, or just gives someone time to line up the kill. The hooded figure answers Aster's offer with a cool promise of his own, because this meeting is turning from a threat into a test of who blinks first. He cuts off the posturing, tells the others to stop trying to scare Aster, and sends them to bring Oberon and Rayleigh, which means this deal is already pulling bigger names into the room. Back in the room with Aster and the robed group, the mood shifts from noise to business. Aster says he has something to say, and the others finally stop treating him like a nuisance long enough to listen, because now the conversation is about terms instead of blood. Aster immediately goes after the tension between them, asking if they are still angry because he hit one of them yesterday. The hooded figure gives him the courtesy of an explanation, and that opens the door to the real subject: why he vanished and what kind of trouble he dragged back with him. That answer arrives in the worst possible form, because the group is not dealing with a rumor or a scare tactic, but a real Death Knight, an undead knight that still carries the proud sword of the Emperor and the ego to match. The hooded figure challenges the usual panic by asking whether anyone here can fight better than him, which is a fancy way of saying no one gets to act righteous while being useless. The Death Knight then speaks like a man who has not forgotten who he was, only what was done to him. He says he was once a loyal knight of the Emperor, but a black mage insulted that loyalty and cursed him into this burning, fleshless misery, so now revenge is the only thing keeping him moving. That confession snaps the scene into a larger war, because the Death Knight is not just a monster with a grudge, he is proof that the enemy's cruelty creates the very vengeance, coming back to bite them. The hooded figure meets that pain with a warning, and the story then shifts to a military camp at night, where a leader prepares the group and the operatives harden themselves around one simple truth. Some fight for justice, some for family, and some for revenge. In the camp right before the next move, the red-clad fighter cuts across the operative's path, and the blue-clad commander snaps at him to get out of the way. It is a tiny order, but that is the point. This team is done standing around, and the mission is already pulling them forward. Then the operative hardens into the kind of face that says hesitation is over. The last beat of calm is gone, and whatever comes next will be handled by people who have already chosen their side.